Order. Chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I want to thank you all for being here today and welcome to the Energy, Climate, Grid Security Subcommittee hearing titled Politics Over People, How Biden's LNG Export Ban Threatens America's Energy and Economic Security. Ignoring science and heeding the loudest of his political base, President Biden recently moved to ban exports of U.S. liquefied natural gas, or LNG. And he did this over the best interest of the American people. Less than 2 weeks ago, the Biden administration announced that it would impose an indefinite ban on the issuance of LNG export permits to non-free trade agreement countries while it conducts a review to consider the climate impacts of natural gas. The Biden administration did not issue an executive order or request Congress to enact legislation, but instead issued this major policy shift through a fact sheet and a press release. The announcement indicates no endpoint or timeline for this indefinite pause. We invited the Department of Energy to testify, but they declined to send anyone to this hearing. They left America and communities throughout Louisiana and Texas with many unanswered questions and unrecognized concerns. I'm thankful, however, we'll get to hear from witnesses who can speak to the benefits of U.S. LNG and how the ban on LNG exports will harm the American economy, our energy security, and our national security. LNG exports strengthen energy security, create jobs, decrease energy prices here at home, and lower emissions globally. U.S. LNG exports could support up to 452,000 additional American jobs and add up to $73 billion to the U.S. economy by 2040. They can also create billions of dollars in revenues for federal, state, and local governments. In addition to undercutting our domestic energy industry, President Biden's decision is a gift of Vladimir Putin. Global demand for natural gas is expected to increase 46% by 2050. And our European and Asian allies who want to do business with the United States will now look to Qatar, Russia, and Iran to meet their growing energy needs. The Biden administration's energy policy has been a handout to our adversaries. The happiest person when Biden took office was Vladimir Putin. He knew he could continue to exploit the stranglehold of the well-funded radical climate lobby has on this administration. These radical environmentalists don't seem to care about the economic and environmental benefits of exporting U.S. gas has, especially to countries desperate to escape energy poverty. Under current law, any person wishing to import or export U.S. natural gas must first obtain approval from FERC to construct and operate an LNG facility. This requires applicants to complete an environmental and safety review. After FERC issues the certification, DOE conducts a public interest review of the project. DOE is required to do this for all exports going to non-free trade agreement countries. DOE is required to grant the export application unless it is found that the proposed exportation and importation of LNG is not in the public interest. Congress intended the public interest requirement to consider economic factors when it originally enacted the Natural Gas Act. The Biden administration has weaponized this review in order to pursue climate objectives. Ironically, Biden and the environmental radicals are going to achieve the opposite because a ban of U.S. LNG exports will increase global emissions. Republicans have a solution. My colleague, Congressman Pfluger, recently introduced H.R. 7176, the Unlocking Our Domestic LNG Potential Act. This is a bill formerly led by Representative Bill Johnson. This bill would lift all DOE restrictions on the import and export of natural gas. Export facilities would still have to receive certification from FERC, but DOE would no longer be able to halt exports based on this administration's weaponized public interest test. DOE has consistently found that U.S. LNG exports serve the public interest because they contribute positive economic benefits and strengthen energy security for the American people. These exports also have the potential to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. Mr. Pfluger's bill is a solution to pushing back on yet another awful Biden energy policy, and I urge all my colleagues to support that effort. So I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses today, hearing all the member questions and answers, and I'll now recognize the ranking member to get for 5 minutes for opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The United States leads the world in both the production and exportation of liquefied natural gas, also known as LNG. According to the Department of Energy, the U.S. harnesses enough LNG energy capacity to export 14 billion cubic feet per day. Based on FERC's latest report, there are enough LNG facilities under construction that are fully permitted to nearly double our current export capacity, and enough facilities that have not yet started construction. Enough facilities that have not yet started construction but are fully approved by both DOE and FERC to more than triple our current export capacity over the next decade. These efforts will keep the U.S. on track to lead the world in LNG exports for years to come. Each proposed LNG export facility must undergo a rigorous permitting process outlined by the Natural Gas Act, beginning with FERC and ending with DOE. Applicants must obtain authorization from FERC to construct and operate a proposed LNG facility. Once approved by FERC, DOE considers whether the proposed export of natural gas is consistent with public interest. It's important to note that DOE is required to grant the application unless it's found to be inconsistent with public interest. So this sets a high burden of proof for denying a project. So many people may be curious as to what defines the, quote, public interest. It's a purposefully broad phrase, and it encompasses both economic and environmental considerations. It's imperative for DOE to include pertinent factors like domestic energy prices, greenhouse gas emissions, and impacts on communities that have been hit hardest by pollution throughout our history when considering how a project will affect our nation. As everybody here knows, this past month, the Biden administration announced a temporary pause on pending approvals of new LNG exports. This pause was announced to fulfill the administration's duty to protect Americans' interests under the Natural Gas Act and to allow DOE to update its underlying analysis for LNG authorizations. Analysis which was last updated in 2018, when the U.S. was exporting only 1/3 of the capacity that we have today. Now, that was pre-COVID, and the impact of the pandemic on our economy and communities must be taken into consideration. The fact that our nation's production has ramped up so quickly must be considered, especially since the U.S. currently has enough approved capacity to fulfill the world's energy needs in the short and medium terms. Continuously increasing LNG exports without updating guidelines to account for new information is a fundamentally unserious proposal. The administration's pause will allow them to update guidance to make sure we're not approving additional LNG exports to support other countries at the cost of Americans back home. This is responsible policymaking. In short, this pause will allow the Biden administration to better assess what future projects actually are in the public interest, while taking into account every aspect of these projects, including, critically, the emissions and pollution they create. The majority is attempting to rebrand this temporary pause as a, quote, ban on issuing LNG export permits, which is false. And I'm sure I'm going to have to repeat that over and over again today. So let me repeat it right now. The majority is attempting to rebrand this temporary pause as a, quote, ban on issuing LNG export permits, which is simply not true. Their plan is to give full authority over LNG exports to FERC and completely cut out any consideration of the public interest. I find it frustrating that the majority has labeled this temporary pause as harmful to American interests when unfettered production of LNG and the pollution that comes with it is what will harm our communities both in the short and in the long term. The Biden administration's temporary pause only directly impacts 6 projects that have been approved by FERC and are pending at DOE. 6 projects when we're already on track to increase production by 200% in the next decade. So these harmful mischaracterizations of the administration's action omit so many important facts. It's just simply hard not to be cynical about the purpose of this hearing. And so I think we should get serious here in Congress. I yield back.
Chair will now recognize the chair of the full committee, Chair Rodgers, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Good morning. The U.S. is blessed with tremendous natural resources, which we've been able to harness as a result of free markets and an entrepreneurial spirit that is uniquely American. We've harnessed the power of nuclear energy, electrified millions of rural Americans' homes with clean hydropower, and ushered in the shale revolution, which unleashed clean natural gas. As a result of this, America is the #1 producer and exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world. This has helped us shift markets and bolster our own energy security and that of our allies away from adversaries like Russia and Iran, and has enabled the U.S. to reduce emissions more than any other nation, both at home and abroad. Leadership matters. American leadership matters. Rather than celebrating this legacy, President Biden is heeding the calls, as he puts it, of radical environmental activists who are intent on shutting down American energy. The president's recent decision to impose a moratorium on new permits for clean U.S. natural gas exports is the latest example of his administration putting politics over people. The administration has made its intentions clear. This is not a pause, as they claimed. This is a ban. The administration is ignoring the fact that natural gas continues to create millions of new jobs, bring manufacturing back to the U.S., and provide and revitalize our communities across the country. In 2022, in Pennsylvania alone, the natural gas industry supported $41.4 billion in economic activity. The shale gas development supported over 120,000 jobs. And there's similar experiences in states and communities across the country. President Biden's LNG export ban will end these benefits for local economies, kill American jobs, and increase energy prices for people across the board. It will send manufacturing overseas, increase our dangerous dependence upon China, and discourage investment in future American energy production. This ban is not only bad for our country, it's bad for our allies. The U.S. LNG has been the lifeline to Europe ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It has helped reduce natural gas prices in Europe by over 83% since 2002 levels following Russia's invasion. In December 2023 alone, 61% of U.S. LNG exports went to Europe, keeping their homes heated, their businesses running, and their lights on. And it has also helped them reduce emissions. Not only is U.S. LNG more than 40% cleaner than Russian natural gas, it's a better option for power generation than other alternatives currently being used. U.S. exports spurred our European allies to quickly invest in new LNG import facilities in order to further wean themselves off of Russian natural gas. This decision to ban exports is a gift to Putin, and we all know Putin is using energy as a weapon. This is giving the Russians greater leverage over our allies while further funding their evil activities, including the aggression against the Ukrainian people. It will destabilize Europe's energy market and signal to our allies that we are no longer a dependable partner. From day one, President Biden has mobilized bureaucrats across the federal government to force an energy transition on Americans. From efforts like the Clean Power Plan 2.0, which will force states to change fundamentally how they generate electricity and raise costs across the board, to electric vehicle mandates that force Americans to buy electric vehicles, more expensive, less reliable alternatives. This administration's rush to green agenda is shutting down American energy production, driving up cost to consumers, costing people their jobs, and making us more reliant on China and our allies more dependent upon Russia. America's abundant energy resources are critical to our economic and national security. Instead of shutting down American energy, we must ensure energy security for us and our allies. President Biden's keep it in the ground policies are unsustainable, and they're harming America's future. Only by standing up for American values of free market, competition, innovation, environmental stewardship can we protect our future. Today's hearing will give all the members an opportunity to hear from some perspectives that are currently being intentionally left out of the conversation. And we'll hear about important solutions like HR 7176, led by Representative Pfluger, which will immediately end the Biden administration's ban on LNG exports. The president must stop putting politics over people. He must reverse this reckless decision and stop the attacks on American energy independence. With that, I yield back.
Julie yields back, and I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing will look at the Biden administration's recent action to ensure that exports of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, benefit all Americans. This is a common sense action. Before we send our energy resources abroad, it is only right that we first confirm doing so is in the American people's best interest, not the interests of our competitors. We should examine the impacts of LNG exports on energy prices, global greenhouse gas emissions, and environmental justice communities. China is also a leading destination for American LNG, and that deserves scrutiny. The president's action is not in China's interest. If you oppose China, you should favor the president's action. Furthermore, the law requires the Department of Energy to determine that LNG exports to non-free trade agreement countries are in the public interest before approving them. The Natural Gas Act is crystal clear in this regard, and the Biden administration's actions are designed to ensure that the Department of Energy is following the law. After all, the LNG market is completely different in the United States now than it was 6 years ago. Back in 2018, there were only 2 operating LNG export terminals in the United States for a combined capacity of 4.8 billion cubic feet per day. Now there are 7 operating facilities with the ability to export triple that amount, and DOE has already approved enough export permits to triple our LNG exports again. Today, the United States is also far and away the largest natural gas producer in the world. We alone account for 25% of the entire world's production every day, outproducing the next 2 biggest producers combined. If we're evaluating whether LNG exports are in the public interest in 2024, we should be using 2024 data and analysis to make that determination. There are a lot of reasons why the law does not allow for unfettered exports of LNG without review. The first reason is that LNG exports can drive up energy prices for American consumers. 2 years ago, we saw natural gas prices here at home triple to levels not seen since 2008, all because of Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent European energy crisis. According to one estimate, the price increases due to American LNG exports cost Americans more than $100 billion over 16 months. This alone is a perfect example of why the DOE review is necessary. And the DOE's examination is also necessary considering that a huge amount of our nation's LNG exports go to China. In 2021, China was the second most popular destination for American LNG exports. Republicans say they're tough on China, but in their pursuit of unlimited LNG exports, they're not only increasing prices on American consumers, but providing cheap natural gas to fuel China's industrial economy. That is contrary to American interests. Finally, DOE must examine the impacts of LNG exports on greenhouse gas emissions and on frontline environmental justice communities. Expanding LNG export infrastructure could drastically increase greenhouse gas emissions, and it's unclear if LNG exports are cleaner than other fossil fuels once you properly account for methane leakage during liquefaction. And these are questions that DOE must also answer. Studies also show that communities located near oil and gas facilities face serious adverse negative health impacts, including increased rates of asthma, lung cancer, and premature deaths. We can't ignore these impacts, and DOE must include them in any public interest tests so that we can better protect these communities in the future. Now, we're likely to hear a lot of misinformation from the Republican majority today, so let me set the record straight. This pause will not change the current export flow of LNG to Europe. It will not affect the LNG facilities currently under construction or the facilities that are already approved and have yet to begin construction. If the Department of Energy never approved another permit, our LNG exports could still triple from now until the end of the decade, and that's more than enough to ensure that Europe gets all the gas it needs. It is also ironic that Republicans are voicing concern for Europeans when they have refused to provide support to our Ukrainian allies as they continue to suffer from a barbaric invasion by Putin. Well over a majority of committee Republicans opposed the Ukraine aid package when it came up for a vote. Instead, House Republicans continue to do the bidding of their corporate polluter friends, pushing H.R. 1130, legislation that will remove all public interest determinations from LNG exports. It's just another example of Republicans putting polluters over people. The Biden administration is rightfully taking a different approach, making sure any additional LNG exports benefit the American people. And this action builds on the administration's commitment to lowering energy costs for Americans and protecting them from corporate polluters, the practice of corporate polluters of putting profits over people. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and that concludes the members' opening statements. Chair would like to remind members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. We'll now move into the witness testimony, and we want to thank all of our witnesses for being here and taking time to testify before this subcommittee. Each witness will have the opportunity to give an opening statement, followed by a round of questions from members. There's some lights in front of you, green, yellow, red, kind of self-explanatory, gets to red, need to wrap up. If not, I'll start gaveling, and then you will need to wrap up. Our witnesses for today, Mr. Toby Rice, President, CEO of EQT Corporation, Mr. Eric Cormier from Southwest Louisiana, Senior Vice President of Entrepreneurship and Strategic Initiatives with the Southwest Louisiana Chamber of Economic Development Allies, and I want to applaud Louisiana for electing Jeff Landry, a former colleague, as your new governor. Look forward to good things in Louisiana. And Ms. Is it Gillian or Jillian?
Jillian.
Jillian Gianetti, Senior Attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council. And lastly, Brigham McCown, Senior Fellow and Director of Initiative on American Energy Security at the Hudson Institute. So we appreciate you being here today. I'll now recognize Mr. Rice for a 5-minute opening statement.
Chair Duncan, Ranking Member DeGette, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to participate in today's hearing. My name is Toby Rice. I am the President and CEO of EQT, America's largest natural gas producer. You know, I find myself in disbelief that I am seated in front of Congress today, responding to a moratorium on authorizations of U.S. LNG exports less than 2 years after this industry literally kept the lights on in Europe following Russia's invasion on Ukraine. That alone should be the end of the discussion. And for those of you that say Europe today is in the clear, it is worth noting that this is the second time I had to defend against calls to curtail U.S. LNG arguments on both climate and cost impact. The first time was a letter I sent to Secretary Granholm just 8 days before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That U.S. LNG saved Europe is just the latest in a long list of monumental achievements by the U.S. natural gas industry. It wasn't too long ago that our country was importing natural gas. Today, thanks to the shale revolution, our country finds itself in a position of energy independence, power, and wealth, as opposed to relying on Russia, Iran, or Qatar for our natural gas needs. Thanks to the shale gas revolution, we have had so much abundance that we have been able to power our allies in Europe and Southeast Asia, fostering trade and geopolitical alliances through the export of LNG. And thanks to the shale gas revolution, over the last 2 decades, not only has the U.S. had the lowest energy costs in the world, resulting in one of the strongest economies in the world, it has led the world in emissions reduction. The shale gas revolution single-handedly contributed to over 60% of the emissions reduction in the United States since the turn of the century by doing one simple thing: displacing coal with natural gas. The announcement from the Biden administration has sent shockwaves across both sides of the Capitol and both sides of the aisle. You see both Republicans and Democrats in a welcomed moment of bipartisanship urgently calling for Biden administration to undo this decision, a decision that will undoubtedly have a short, medium, and long-term impacts on our allies and our climate. Let's call this what it is. The Biden administration's decision was pure politics. The moratorium was made under the guise of updated research and a claim that we needed updated studies on the environmental and economic impact of U.S. LNG. But we all know what it really is, and that's an election year stall designed to garner votes. The Biden administration is touting the moratorium as a win for climate. In reality, it is significantly a blow backwards towards climate. As anyone that has taken the time to look at the data knows, we are hitting all-time highs for global emissions year over year. And outside of the United States, nearly half of these emissions are coming from international coal. Over the last 2 decades, it has become clear that the fastest, most impactful way to address this problem is to replace international coal with domestic natural gas. But still, there are those who say, what's the big deal? We're still the largest producer of natural gas. We're the largest exporter of LNG. Is it not enough? Well, let me ask you this question. Is replacing only 7% of the world's largest source of emissions enough? Not to me, and I think a lot of our friends pushing for climate solutions would agree. Now is not the time to slow down LNG. Now is the time to accelerate it. This is not to say that this industry is giving itself a free pass. We're doing everything we can to continue to provide Americans and our allies with abundant, affordable, reliable, and particularly cleaner energy. Take EQT, for example. Since 2019, we have cut our methane intensity by roughly 70%, and by the end of this year, we expect to be the first traditional energy company of scale in the world to achieve net zero on a Scope 1 and Scope 2 basis. It is this gas, not Russia's gas, not Iran's gas, and not Chinese coal, that the administration is seeking to block from entering global markets. The markets work, and if our cleaner, more affordable, more reliable gas is taken out of that market, it is Russia, Iran, and Chinese coal that will benefit, not the climate. And this gas is not the government's. It's owned by companies like mine and millions of American citizens. Since 2020, the gas that my company sold has resulted in billions of dollars being paid directly to landowners and in rural Appalachia in the form of state taxes. That money has funded family farms, schools, hospitals, roads, and community foundations in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio, all for simply allowing us to provide the cleanest form of traditional energy in the world. We are fortunate to live in a country that is blessed with abundant resources, a country that has a top-of-the-line workforce, and the ingenuity of the American people. We are privileged to be able to argue over our energy mix and the weighting of various energy sources over others. But this is not the case for so many outside our borders. We have the opportunity to provide energy security to the globe and to show how other countries can eventually follow our footsteps in reducing emissions. This is what the United States does. We lead. Let's stop playing politics with energy. Let's follow the data. And instead of pausing LNG, let's unleash it.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now recognize Mr. Cormier for 5 minutes.
To the honorable members of the committee, I want to offer greetings from residents and business community of Southwest Louisiana. Again, my name is Eric Cormier. I'm Senior Vice President of Entrepreneurship and Strategic Initiatives for our agency. Southwest Louisiana comprises of 5 parishes: Allen, Beauregard, Calcasieu, Cameron, and Jeff Davis, for a total of 1,978 people. I want to tell you more about us, but time does not permit. Today, I'm here to offer insights from our Chamber of Southwest Louisiana perspective regarding the Biden administration's decision to pause decisions related to the export of liquefied natural gas to non-free trade agreement countries pending a Department of Energy review of project evaluation policy. On January 26, 2024, when the administration announced its decision, my cell phone rang quite a bit. It was members of our regional Main Street calling. Small business owners were panicking. These folks have built business plans for the expected final investment decisions for Venture Global CP2, Commonwealth LNG, Magnolia LNG, and Lake Charles LNG, representing $28.5 billion in projected projects. If those companies are able to make a final investment decision, we're looking at 7,200 permanent and temporary jobs, construction up to 25,000 employees, and $500 million in labor costs. That's old-fashioned American business that trickles down to Main Street. LNG has been part of the Southwest Louisiana economic tapestry since 1981, when trunk-line LNG imported natural gas for regasification from Algeria. Due to the shale revolution and federal policy changes, America decided to allow companies to readily export this natural resource to the world market. That process started in 2016. As a result, the Lake Charles MSA, which is Calcasieu and Cameron parishes, has become a strategic area of LNG expansion and investment due to our region's extensive pipeline system, the Calcasieu River Ship Channel, workforce, and a strong community connection to industry going back to the early 1900s. Today, Cheniere, Sabine Pass LNG, Sempra Cameron LNG, and Venture Global Calcasieu Pass are exporting this important product on the world market. According to the Lake Erie Industry Alliance, those 3 companies combined for a total of $34 billion in investment in our region, which created over 3,000 direct jobs, 16,000 construction jobs, $1.2 billion in labor costs, and $1 billion gross domestic product. That's important because in 2020 and 2021, we suffered COVID, Hurricane Laura, Hurricane Delta, Winter Storm Uri, along with a major flooding event, which resulted, for instance, in Laura, $17 billion in damages, 44,000 homes damaged by Laura and Delta, and the unemployment rate hit at 14.1% just in September 2020. Louisiana economist Dr. Lauren Scott stated that Lake Charles has the distinction of having the worst COVID recovery in the 9 MSAs in the state. As of July 2023, the MSA had recovered only 45% of the post-2019 losses. By the way, Dr. Scott noted that Lake Charles's MSA was the fastest growing between 2012 and 2018 for a city of our size. That is when our industrial base got really burning going, and LNG was the biggest factor. Regularly, our community members and business stakeholders ask Chamber of Southwest Louisiana members, when are those final investment decisions are going to be made? Why? Because they have their businesses on the line. They've made those business plans. I've had parents call me. Their kids are going to McNeese State and Suala Community College, and they're asking, can my kid get that LNG job? Because we've worked with them to develop that workforce. So just so you know, Southwest Louisiana is in the early stages of a clean energy future. Right now, our office is working with our governmental partners, developers, and innovators to pave the way for solar, wind, and hydrogen energy development. Yet we are not there yet. Natural gas is the gap filler to alternative forms of clean energy. The Chamber of Southwest Louisiana adamantly disagrees with the Biden administration's decision to indefinitely pause LNG projects going forward. This decision has unintended consequences which impact our community. Main Street is upset and scared. We want to move forward and progress. Thank you for your time.
I thank the gentleman, and I now just want to recognize former United States Senator Mary Landrieu from the great state of Louisiana attending this. Thanks for your leadership on this issue. I now go to Ms. Gianetti for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Duncan, Ranking Member DeGette, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Jillian Gianetti, and I'm a senior attorney for the Sustainable FERC project at the Natural Resources Defense Council. I specialize in natural gas law. Before I joined NRDC, I was an oil and gas attorney in private practice representing the LNG industry. I started my career as a public school teacher at East St. John High School in Reserve, Louisiana. Reserve is located in the heart of Cancer Alley in the fossil fuel industry. A disproportionate number of my students had asthma and other respiratory conditions. I care deeply about the Gulf, its culture, and its ecosystem. Today, I will discuss the Biden administration's important but moderate January 26, 2024 decision to pause the Department of Energy's reviews for some liquefied natural gas exports. I'd like to explain what this policy is, what it isn't, and why this pause is an important common sense measure that all Americans should support. The relevant law here is the Natural Gas Act. Under the Natural Gas Act, LNG exports are treated differently, depending on whether the U.S. has a free trade agreement with the destination country that addresses natural gas. Countries with such an agreement are called FTA countries, and the rest NFTA countries. DOE must approve all gas exports to FTA countries, period. And nothing in the administration's January 26th announcement changes that. All current and future FTA exports are unaffected by the pause. The pause also does not affect any current LNG exports, whether FTA or NFTA, or any project that DOE has already approved. These projects alone are expected to double the U.S.'s LNG export capacity by 2027. And the pause has zero effect on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's authority to review applications to build new natural gas export terminals or pipelines. Instead, the administration's pause relates exclusively to prospective gas exports to NFTA countries. Under the Natural Gas Act, DOE must evaluate whether a proposed gas export is consistent with the public interest. If consistent, they must be approved, and if not, they must be denied. DOE has never found a proposed NFTA gas export to be inconsistent with the public interest. And that brings us to the reason for the pause. Put simply, DOE's tools for assessing whether future gas exports are consistent with the public interest are both obsolete and inapplicable. First, DOE has never published guidelines for evaluating the public interest for LNG exports. Never. In 1984, the Reagan administration published guidelines for LNG imports, but this is the closest the DOE has come to speaking on the subject, even though the U.S. is now the world's leading LNG exporter. Trying to assess 2024 LNG exports based on guidelines written for 1984 LNG imports is like trying to stream Netflix over a Betamax. Second, the studies DOE relies on need revision. Although these studies date to 2018 and 2019, LNG exports have increased by nearly 200% since then, and these studies also include outdated analyses of the domestic pricing, consumer, and climate impacts of LNG exports. The administration's January 26th pause enables DOE to update these updated tools, receive public comment, and avoid issuing decisions that are legally unsound. In other words, the administration's pause puts the horse back in front of the cart. To that end, the pause wisely does not prescribe, recommend, or predetermine what the final analysis will look like, nor does it prematurely declare a position on any pending application. Remember, this action does not pause any current LNG exports, any already approved LNG exports, or any future FTA exports. And yet, it represents the boldest action that any administration has ever taken to ensure that DOE is properly assessing the impacts of exporting LNG on the U.S. public interest. In short, the January 26th pause is a common sense move that both respects our allies and puts the U.S. public interest front and center. And that's exactly what the Natural Gas Act demands. Thank you.
Generally yields back. I'll now go to Mr. Cowan for 5 minutes.
Chairman Duncan, Ranking Member DeGette, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you this morning. In addition to Hudson, I also serve as a professor at Miami University in Ohio, and I've spent nearly 3 decades on active and active reserve duty as a naval officer and naval aviator, and have also held multiple senior appointments in the executive branch, working directly for cabinet members from both parties. The views I express today are mine and do not represent any other entity. We are experiencing significant geopolitical risks emanating across multiple theaters of operation. These strategic challenges seek to undermine our democratic values by those actors with significant control and influence over energy resources. America has long provided the tools, equipment, and resources that make freedom possible. The arsenal of democracy wasn't just about our innovation, our industrial base, or agricultural industry. These have always been certainly very important, but the glue for these efforts has always been American energy, which, for example, supplied our allies with 85% of all the oil and gas used during World War II. International events have brought into sharp focus the intrinsic relationship between energy, economics, and national security. It has also highlighted the degree to which an important American strategic asset, abundant energy resources, has been undermined by dramatic shifts in U.S. policy, which have often failed to consider such decisions' full and long-term implications. Last year marked the 50th anniversary of the Arab oil embargo, reminding us of the short-lived past energy policies that gave away our energy independence and the resulting dependencies that remained for decades. We're also reminded of short-sighted energy policies as Europe struggled following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Last month, natural gas spot prices for EU countries averaged $9.56 per million BTUs. Lower, but still impactful as Europe's economic competitiveness and deindustrialization caused by these high energy prices continues. That said, Europe fares far better off than it would have been absent American LNG. By contrast, yesterday's U.S. Henry Hub price stood at $2.26 per million BTUs. Europe should not be allowed to recede into the background. Energy security highlights the need for a comprehensive approach and a stable policy environment coupled with innovation, technology, and international cooperation. Our allies would like to be able to have energy security as well. It has also highlighted the degree to which a strategic American asset has come to the rescue. Energy security, of course, is the ability to ensure the uninterrupted availability of reliable and affordable energy for consumption. It encompasses not only the supply of energy resources, but the resiliency of the energy infrastructure and the ability of a country to meet its current and future projected energy demands, while also dealing with emergencies, natural disasters, geopolitical tensions, and other issues that could disrupt supplies. This, in turn, requires a predictable and stable policy environment. Some have suggested that Europe or other allies have enough LNG. Still, it's prudent to note that our rather stoic allies have expressed real frustration with this decision, which for them directly undermines the very definition of energy security. Energy requirements in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere are expected to increase, not decrease. Additional LNG supply is required to continue lowering prices for Europe so they can become competitive again. Every Russian molecule that we remove reduces the money and the ability of the Kremlin to wage war. The need for redundancy to account for plant outages and other unforeseen events cannot be overlooked. The concern that America is seen as using energy as a policy weapon in global trade is real, and that an unreliable America pushes buyers and purchasers of LNG to other suppliers, or in the absence of availability, revert to higher emitting sources. The factors I just mentioned are not theoretical, but highly probable should this de facto ban not be reversed. Energy policies don't exist in isolation. They're not in a vacuum. They're inextricably linked to domestic and foreign policy principles. Finally, the very premise of the administration's decision seems counterintuitive, given the plethora of scholarly research on the subject to date. Thank you, and I look forward to addressing your questions.
I thank you each for your testimony, and we'll now move into the question and answer portion of the hearing. And I'll begin the questioning and recognize myself for 5 minutes. Australia, Bahrain, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Israel, Jordan, Korea, Mexico, Morocco, Nicaragua, Oman, Panama, Peru, Singapore, and the USMCA. Those are the countries we have free trade agreements with. What's missing from that list is the Czech Republic and Poland and a lot of other Eastern European countries that are historically been reliant upon Vladimir Putin and Russia for gas and energy in general. Also Japan, Taiwan, and others around the world that are looking to the United States to help them provide a clean, stable supply of energy to meet their growing needs and their energy security needs. I mentioned Poland, Czech Republic. In 1 year's time, they built a pipeline from Norway after Putin invaded Ukraine. 1 year, a pipeline from Norway to provide natural gas to Poland. Imagine if we could do that in the United States of America, to deliver gas to our communities and to export terminals to help our friends and allies around the world. What signal does this send from the Biden administration to the world? The signal I think it sends is we don't care about your energy security. We've never manipulated natural gas or any energy source for political gain, like Vladimir Putin has by manipulating the spigot for European countries to influence political policy there. They faced a reality check when Putin invaded Ukraine. They need to meet their energy needs of their constituents, their citizens, and they've looked west to the United States of America because they've always known they could count on us to provide their needs in the energy sector when called upon. I'm going to start by entering in the record a letter opposing President Biden's LNG export ban signed by 152 Republican members of Congress. I co-authored this letter with Chair Rodgers, the Speaker of the House, House leadership. This letter expresses opposition to the DOE's ban on LNG export. So without objection, so ordered. There's bipartisan outrage over President Biden's election year stunt. The president received a similar letter from House Democrats by our colleagues on this committee, and I commend them for that. As our letter states, this decision is economically and strategically dangerous and unnecessary. Under both Democrat and Republican administration, the DOE has consistently found that U.S. LNG exports serve the public interest because they contribute positive economic benefits and strengthen energy security for the American people. They also have the potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Mr. Rice, how does this announcement impact American energy workers, including in Pennsylvania, and what signal does this send to investors and job creators?
Well, it's certainly not helpful, and it's actually destructive. You know, these facilities require billions of dollars of investments to make happen, and any sign that there is going to be political force introduced into market forces is going to make it very difficult to invest. You can look at what we're doing in our company and the impact this has for our communities. You know, natural gas exports represent about 15% of the production. I think it's really important for everybody to understand this production only exists to meet market demands, and exports are that market demand. So you could make an argument that of the $1 billion of royalties that we pay directly to our landowners in Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, about 15% of those royalties are directly attributable towards meeting LNG exports. So $150 million directly going to our landowner payments. These are big deals to the people that we have in Pennsylvania, on top of all of the jobs that we talk about.
Thank you for that. This latest move to ban exports is part of a broader campaign to undercut American energy production. Following the announcement, Sierra Club executive director stated the Biden administration is listening to the calls to break America's reliance on dirty fossil fuels. Another example of this is the campaign by radical environmentalists to block pipelines. This especially hurts states like South Carolina, where I represent. Our population growth is outpacing our energy supply. We need to expand our infrastructure to deliver affordable natural gas from the Marcellus or from Louisiana and Texas. Both the Atlantic Coast and Mount Valley pipelines face these challenges, which ultimately ended up in the cancellation of the ACP. How do you view these politically driven decisions, Mr. Rice, to ban exports and ban pipelines?
I think the biggest concern with the pause on the LNG exports is that this is the start of the playbook to block American energy infrastructure. And this playbook has been used successfully to block pipelines, and that has been incredibly destructive and caused rampantly high, unnecessarily high energy prices in America. Sowing doubts, concerns, fear has translated as the first step. Calling for unnecessary studies is the second step. Ultimately, this just leads to more delay tactics. And you can see the result of what's happened in pipelines. We've blocked almost 7 BCF a day's worth of pipelines that would deliver gas to places that you just mentioned. And as a result, you've got bizarre situations like in Boston, they're paying $30 for their natural gas when we're producing that same natural gas in Pennsylvania for a price of $3. The only way you can explain those high prices is the lack of pipeline infrastructure. And the biggest issue that I see in this whole equation comes down to accountability. Who is accountable for these higher energy prices? When energy prices are high in Boston, guess who gets the letter from senators about the high energy prices? I do. Not the person that was responsible for blocking that pipeline infrastructure. So I think one of the important elements here that we need to bring in is we need to bring more accountability on these decisions that are being made.
Thank you for that. My time's expired. I will have some additional questions we'll submit for you guys to answer. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Gett, for 5 minutes.
Well, I can't help but sitting here thinking that the silly season has begun because my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are very, very, very concerned what's going to happen in the areas around Ukraine and in that part of the world and places where we don't have treaties, and if we can't supply the energy, these are the self-same people who are about to walk down to the U.S. House of Representatives floor later this afternoon and vote for an aid package that doesn't include aid for Ukraine. And Ukraine is under continuous threat from Russia every single day. So I would suggest that we get serious. And if we want to support democracy in that region, including energy supports from the United States, that we get together in a bipartisan way and we support not only aid to Israel, which I support, not only humanitarian aid around the world, but also aid to Ukraine. The best thing we can do to support democracy in that region is to support that aid and also to support continuing U.S. LNG exports and other energy exports to that area. And I'm getting sick of this because it is campaign season, but we're talking about real lives and we're talking about international democracy right here today. I'm going to ask you, Ms. Gianetti, a couple of questions. I said this in my opening statement, that the majority is going to keep talking about a ban on issuing LNG export permits. And lo, it was true. The chairman mentioned that about 3 or 4 times in his questions just now. So I'm going to ask you, is the Biden administration's pause some sort of a ban on LNG exports?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. No, it is not.
And can you confirm that this pause will have no impact on the LNG export facilities that are currently operating?
That's correct.
And can you confirm this will have no impact on the LNG export facilities that are currently under construction?
That's correct, or ones that are not yet under construction that are already with their DOE authorizations.
Right. And and I think this is what you're referring to, can you confirm that this will have no impact on the LNG export facilities that are not under any construction but are fully permitted?
That's correct.
And finally, just so we can get a sense of the numbers here, given the amount of permits DOE has issued, can you confirm that we could triple U.S. LNG exports without issuing a single new permit?
That is correct. We are on track to double our exports by 2027 and triple into the early parts of the 2030s without any new authorizations.
Thank you. Now, Mr. McCown, I just want to ask you about the significant geopolitical risks that are emanating across multiple theaters of operation that you talk about in your written testimony, and you also mentioned, if we don't give aid to Ukraine, aside from the energy issue, this is going to continually destabilize American interests in that region. Isn't that correct? Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chairman yields back. I now recognize the chair of the full committee, Ms. Rodgers, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCown, America's security and prosperity is my #1 priority as chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee. The world is entering a period of increasing conflict and unrest. We've seen global supply chains grind to a halt as a result of the COVID pandemic. Russia's war on Ukraine has dealt a major blow to Europe's economic and energy security. Hamas terrorists brutally attacked Israel, and Iran-backed militias are spreading violence throughout the Middle East. Through all of this, American energy has supported our economy and provided a lifeline to our allies in Europe and around the world. We know dictators like Putin use energy as a weapon. So it is deeply troubling for the administration to voluntarily disarm the U.S. and our allies with policies like these. So my question is, President Biden's political LNG export ban is dangerous and short-sighted. At least that's what I believe. Do you agree that this decision puts America's security and prosperity at risk?
Chair Rodgers, yes, I do. And I think we have to keep this in context that every LNG facility that has been permitted will not necessarily ever get built. So we can't count on that, number one. It's a private market economy. Some projects succeed, others fail. Second, it sends a terrible signal to our allies. I mentioned during my opening that gas prices are still highly elevated in Europe. They need more supply to bring that down. And we can't forget about our Asian allies, Japan and others, given the instability in the South China Sea that require raw materials from outside. So if we want to study, make additional studies, great. But let's not make decisions until those studies have come out. And we all make mistakes, and I hope that we can convinced the Biden administration to reverse course and not gloat, but yet it's the wrong call.
Thank you. As a follow-up, you mentioned the impact on our allies. I really see this as a gift to our adversaries, Putin, Iran. So would you speak to what the impact will be if America withdraws from global energy markets?
Yes, if America becomes unreliable, and even this decision calls into question our continued reliability, countries will seek other options, other more stable options, so as to not have their eggs in one basket. We should keep in mind that the Qataris have, along with the Iranians, share the largest natural gas reserve in the world. And so that point is not lost on me, and that we produce LNG in a more responsible, more environmentally clean manner than any other country in the world.
Yes, yes. The reason that America leads the world in bringing down carbon emissions is because of natural gas. And it has, and we've done that more than any other nation in the world. So it really begs the question, what is President Biden doing and why? Why is he imposing this natural gas export ban? Mr. Rice, U.S. LNG exports delivered to Europe are 41% cleaner than Russian gas. The science is clear on this. Can you set the record straight on the environmental benefits of natural gas?
Well, very simply, on a Scope 3 basis, natural gas is between 40 to 50% cleaner than combusting coal, which is the largest source of emissions on the planet. The numbers that you cited, specifically on the emissions associated with making our product, are really centered on the biggest environmental issue we have on our industry today, which is methane emissions. And I'll tell you what I told Secretary Granholm 24 months ago. If you're concerned about methane emissions, keep the target there, because our industry is going to knock methane emissions out of the park. This is why it's important. We cannot let the emissions associated with making our product overshadow the emission reduction benefits when people use our product. As an example, at EQT, our carbon footprint is about 350,000 tons. That's the emissions it takes for us to run our operations to produce our natural gas. That includes methane emissions. But that amount of operations is going to produce an amount of product, when put on the world stage to replace foreign coal, is going to have an emissions reduction benefit of over 150 million tons. So a 350,000 ton benefit for 150 million benefit.
Thank you. So it's clearly not about reducing carbon emissions. The Department of Energy has already conducted numerous studies also about the economic benefits, the life cycle of greenhouse gas emissions. So the Obama administration and the Trump administration did not stop issuing permits when they were conducting their reviews. What signal does this send for President Biden to reverse trade policy in an election year?
I think it sends a message that the U.S. is willing to override market forces with political force, and I think that's a very dangerous sentiment. I think it's very dangerous to set that precedent.
Thank you. Thank you. I yield back.
Jillian yields back. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have to say, I just don't understand this Republican line that limiting LNG exports helps China. It's just the opposite. It may cripple China's industrial output, but I'm frankly fine with that. Bring the manufacturing back to the United States. Isn't that what we should be striving to accomplish? In any case, when Congress wrote the Natural Gas Act, it was clear in requiring that the government find that exports of natural gas be in the public interest before allowing them. Republicans have pushed to automatically assume that all gas exports are in the public interest, allowing gas to flow based on what most benefits fossil fuel companies rather than what benefits everyday Americans. So my questions are of Ms. Gianetti. Can you discuss why Congress originally required this public interest determination for LNG exports to non-free trade agreement nations? And can you talk about why making sure that determination is thorough and defensible is so important, if you will?
Thank you, Congressman. The public interest standard actually dates to the 1880s with state statutes affecting railroad permitting. For as long as we have been permitting infrastructure in this country, we have understood that it's important to look at a holistic group of factors in evaluating whether that decision is correct. Going back to that time, environmental impacts were part of the consideration. For example, looking at the view shed or impact of infrastructure on a beach. That standard and understanding was universally understood in the 1930s and was part of the reason why this Congress rightfully copied it into the Natural Gas Act.
Thank you. Now, just a few years ago, we saw proof that LNG exports have a clear impact on consumer prices when domestic natural gas prices dropped by 10% in the wake of an explosion at the Freeport LNG export facility, and then when they increased again once that facility was restarted. So, Ms. Gianetti, can you discuss the impacts that LNG exports have on consumer prices and how those impacts must be accounted for in any public interest determination?
Natural gas is like any other commodity where ebbs and flows of supply and demand affect the price. And when the Freeport terminal had its explosion went offline, eventually actually prices dropped domestically by 25%. They then went back up once the Freeport terminal went back online. There's demonstrated evidence time and again that when there is more gas being exported overseas, that domestic pocketbooks are affected. And in fact, there was a study even that came out last night that said if all of the facilities that are affected by the pause were built, that it could raise domestic U.S. consumers' gas prices by up to 14%.
And then finally, I wanted to note that despite what the majority says, it's not clear that American LNG exports are always displacing coal in other countries and therefore reducing emissions. So can you discuss the climate impacts of increased LNG exports? Why is it critical for DOE to have the most up-to-date research on methane emissions from American LNG facilities, pipelines, and producers as it makes a public interest determination, if you will?
With respect to the relationship between LNG and coal, Europe is actually an instructive example. Most of the gas that is going to Europe is being used to heat homes, which does not use coal for that kind of electricity. Additionally, when we're looking at Asia, Japan is not looking to build any coal power plants or anything of that nature. This is not in their system. It's not being affected by the decision of LNG one way or the other. In terms of the climate impacts of LNG, it is a potent fossil fuel. It is methane. It has an extremely powerful GHG impact. And there are impacts across the entire value chain from the extraction of gas, transportation, liquefaction, regasification, and eventual burning.
Thank you. I just, conclude, I really don't understand my colleagues on the other side. It's almost as if they're afraid that if China doesn't get enough energy resources, that's going to hurt their industrial impact and their ability to manufacture goods. Frankly, I could care less. I would almost I prefer if their industrial impact input is reduced and there's an incentive to manufacture here as opposed to in China. It seems to me that's exactly what we're trying to do here. We want to do more manufacturing here and less there. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chairman yields back, and I'll go to Ohio's Mr. Latta for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us today. This is a really important topic, not only for our country, but for my district. In the 5th District of Ohio, we have 86,000 manufacturing jobs. And, if we don't have affordable energy, we can't compete. And what's made this country great in the last several years is our ability to produce this natural gas that makes our companies out there being out there and make what they got to make. There's an article that was in the, or an editorial that was in the Wall Street Journal the other day, and I'd like to get Mr. McCown and Mr. Rice your opinion on this. This is what it says, and I'm not going to read the whole article. The White House says the pause will only affect a handful of projects that are currently seeking Energy Department permits. But this is dishonest. It will also freeze about a half dozen projects seeking FERC approvals and could halt another dozen or so that may have been permitted by previous presidents. That's because the Energy Department in December announced that projects not yet operating will have to reapply for permits. It's been 7 years since they were authorized, so projects in the works could get deep-sixed, even if they have billions of dollars committed in capital and contractual agreements with customers. Mr. McCown, your thoughts.
Thank you very much. My understanding is that there's a shelf life on the permit of 7 years, and then you have to go back through the process, but I'll defer to Mr. Rice on that. But I think what is clear from this is that the policy is cloaked in this this pause. A pause is something I do before answering your question. It's a very short period of time. This is not a pause. This is a ban, and I don't think we're going to see the pause end until after the presidential election. And so I wish they would just call it what it is. It is an imparting environmental goals into stopping a very successful industry.
Hey, Mr. Rice?
Yeah, I mean, after listening to some of these questions and some of the answers here, I mean, the question I have is, if this is just a pause, why do we? It doesn't impact any of the markets. Why do we even have to do this? Why do we have to send this signal that America is going to play games with the energy security of our allies? I think this is a signal that is going to chill investments. And I was in Europe last week, and we had to have many conversations to reassure our allies that America will be able to depend on America to deliver the energy security that they've relied on in the past.
Let me follow up, Mr. Rice. What happens to these companies that might be, as the Wall Street Journal said, might get deep sixed? What happens to these companies out there and their ability in the future to produce natural gas?
Well, I'll tell you the playbook in pipelines, which I think is trying to be played here on the LNG front. Ultimately, these delays, stalls, ultimately increase the cost of these energy projects with the hope that these projects never get funded, never get built. This is exactly what happened with pipelines. And we need to prevent that from happening again, because blocking energy infrastructure in this country is the thing that has crippled our energy security, not only here in America, but preventing us from providing more energy security to our allies.
Well, let me ask you this. Let's go downstream a little bit. What happens to the companies that produce the pipe and the equipment? Do they stay in business if they don't have anybody out there drilling?
Well, without these projects, these companies do not exist. We've seen billions and billions of dollars be destroyed because of the environmental activism that have blocked pipelines, which are the safest way to move energy around this country. And so, just look at MVP as an example. It took an act of Congress to get a pipeline built in this country. Like, people ask me, am I excited about MVP getting passed by Congress? It's exciting for 1 second until you realize we're in a country where it takes an act of Congress to get a piece of energy infrastructure built in this country. Americans should be shaking their heads at that and looking for a fix.
Mr. McGowan, do you think and believe that we have enough sufficient natural gas to supply not only our domestic needs and keep prices low, while also meeting growing demand that's out there, not only in this country, but around the world?
Yes, sir, we absolutely do. And the bottom line is there are short-term price fluctuation swings as markets realign, but the trend line for our own domestic pricing is continuing downward while we are continuing to export more. There is not a direct, it's not a direct relationship, so it's not costing American consumers.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. If I may, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record the Wall Street Journal article from February the 4th of this year for the record.
So without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair will now go to the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have to say, I certainly think that the ranking member made an important point when she noted that people will be anti-Putin in this room and then go down the other building and vote for Putin. And I think it makes it really hard to comprehend. But anyway, and that's where this place is. I've never seen it in a worse spot. And here you are having to deal with us. So I appreciate you being here today. I think that the controversy stems from a wider issue that we've struggled to grapple with, at least on our side of the aisle, which is what's the role that natural gas and LNG play in the resource mix in the short and medium term and in the long term as we seek to decarbonize quickly, as efficiently as possible. Our goal is to eliminate or minimize the harmful emissions of methane and other pollutants into our atmosphere in order to stop the current pace of warming and avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But it's clear that natural gas is not going anywhere anytime soon. And in my view, natural gas and LNG, Mr. Rice, you made the only case to me in my office about what we're going to do about powering up the rest of the world that doesn't involve coal. And I'm concerned, I think we all ought to be, what we really ought to be concerned about is pulling lignite out of the ground and burning it in the developing world. And so I'd like someone to come up with a better case than yours, but I have not heard from the nuclear industry. I've not quite heard how renewables are going to cover this by themselves. So I take it seriously, and we have to keep our lights on and our allies' lights on while displacing dirty and expensive generation. But my focus is on emissions, and whether we're really reducing emissions of harmful pollutants, including methane, through a significant increase in LNG exports. And I think that does mean looking at the life cycle from production to transport to liquefaction and to shipping. And I think it's reasonable for us and the Biden administration to examine those impacts. And I think that's right. Now, I take your point about whether it's a pause or a ban. I don't believe that limiting supply is how you create an energy policy. I mean, we fight over pipeline by pipeline, and we win these battles over pipeline. What good does that do? It doesn't really change the mix. And if we don't export to Europe, they're going to buy from Russia. It's not like they're not going to use fossil fuels. So I think it's just a little bit more ambiguous than both sides are saying. But let me just drive at one point, Mr. Rice. You were quoting tons of emissions. Are you putting methane and carbon dioxide in the same bucket?
Yes, that would include the CO2 equivalent. So you would convert methane into a CO2 equivalent, and that,
So you're
those numbers.
giving credit to the much more harmful impact in the short run that methane has on global warming.
By taking a factor of, I think it's 84 times for the methane emissions, yes.
All right. And I asked Ms. Gianetti, is that fair? What's wrong with that? What's wrong? What is he getting wrong on that in terms of looking at displacing dirtier gas or even coal? Why is he not right?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. You know, one of the key questions that we need to analyze is the net effects of LNG export on our overall carbon footprint. There are pros and cons depending on where we're looking at and what countries we're talking about.
I think we agree on that. Just to put a fine point on it, if he's displacing dirtier gas and coal with cleaner gas, what's the objection to that? Or do you think that's not true?
When we're looking at displacement, the methods of U.S. extraction vary from company to company. Even within the U.S. value chain, we have deep concerns about methane leakage and the impacts that can have on the overall carbon footprint. But, you know, to go back to something
Do you think he's
that
not
might...
accounting for that in his calculations?
Pardon?
Do you think he is not accounting for that leakage in his calculations?
I think that, you know, candidly, I'm not familiar with all of the data that Mr. Rice is talking about, but I do think that in our analyses at DOE, we do not currently, DOE does not currently do that. And, you know, to go back to a comment that Mr. McCown said earlier, you know, he said, let's do the studies and let's make sure that we are not making decisions until those studies are out. That's exactly what the department is doing through this decision.
Well, okay, we're going to run out of time, but it would be interesting to actually have you guys have a conversation. Mr. Rice, why do you think she's not correct?
Yeah, so we get a question a lot. Why do we need LNG? We've got other solutions like solar, we've got wind. Why do we even need LNG? The biggest misconception, I think, is that people don't really understand how much energy demand there is in this world. I don't blame them. That's a big thing to get your head wrapped around. But the reality is this: when solar and wind cannot meet the world's demand for energy, the world is going to use coal.
I'm sorry, we're getting away from the finer point I was trying to make. But anyway, I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I'll go to Kentucky's Mr. Guthrie for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I apologize. There's 2 hearings going on for our full subcommittee hearings. I've been upstairs with the FDA and foreign inspections, which are important for our drug supply chain, but this is also critically important. And I just want to talk about, we're in the middle of debate on Ukraine funding and what's moving forward here in the House and the Senate. And I was in a meeting, and it was, only can say really, a major European ally, and it's someone who certainly spoke for the government, left of center, who said in the meeting to a group of members of Congress, said, "If you want peace, produce gas," as a quote. And one of my colleagues immediately said, "Well, we understand all of the terminals in Europe are full, so even if we produce more LNG, you wouldn't be able to receive it." And this person said, "Well, sell it elsewhere, sell it to Pacific, I don't care. I just need the price to come down. That's what he said. That's a direct quote from somebody who certainly spoke for a government of a major ally in Europe. And it really struck me that the high price of natural gas or energy funds Putin's army, literally funds his army, and we're sitting here debating about sending money to Ukraine to fight the army we're funding because we don't produce enough gas. And so if you look at just the policy, if you're in the Biden White House and you're looking at, I want to restrict exports of LNG, which will raise the price, at the same time asking our hard-charging taxpayers, hard-working taxpayers to fund, and I'm for our friends in Ukraine. Destroying Putin's army in Ukraine is a thing that would be good for America without American men and women doing it. And so Mr. McCown, and I would like to ask you if you would comment on that, just the national security implications of not exporting liquid natural gas.
Yes, Representative Guthrie, thank you very much for that question. Yes, the world is going to get its LNG from somewhere, and if not from us, it's going to be from other less stable, less reliable partners like Russia. Russia has...
But even if they don't get it from Russia, the price goes up.
Correct.
So when Russia sells to somebody other than our European friends, they're getting money.
Yes, and choking off Russia's cash to fund its war effort through decreasing the molecules they're able to place on the market is very important.
Mr. Rice, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I'd just like to talk about how big this opportunity is that we have in the United States. I mean, just real high level, we've studied this. We have a resource that would allow us to be able to support quadrupling our LNG exports to about 60 BCF a day. To put that in perspective, and that would imply a $4 gas price here in the United States, putting it on the doorstep of Europe for a cost of less than $12. 60 BCF a day does not mean a lot to the normal person. But from an energy security perspective, 60 BCF a day is the energy equivalent of adding 10 million barrels a day, which is going to be a decarbonizing force to the world stage. The United States has the opportunity to essentially add a Saudi Arabia of clean energy to the world stage. Think about the amount of peace, prosperity, and influence that can bring from America to the world. It is world-changingly impactful is what we have here in the U.S.
So what would that do to the Russian or Putin's government's ability to wage war?
Well, it certainly would replace their influence in Europe. And if you want to mitigate the influence of petro-dictators, because guess what? Putin is not the only bad actor on the world stage we need to worry about. Bring more energy into the world, lower the cost of energy. You lower the dollars that they're able to get from their selling energy. So again, I mean, there's so many benefits of how LNG can actually increase the security of our allies and also the security of Americans. And
You'd agree with the comment of this European person that said, if you want peace, produce gas.
100%.
Thank you. I want to switch really quickly to Mr. Cormier. Is that how you say it correctly? I'd like to briefly, so I'm pivoting to you. Would you comment on how this decision will impact jobs here at home and communities like those in Southeast Louisiana? Yeah.
When these announcements are made, your universities, your small business people, it's a very interrelated and intermingled type of marketplace. So when a decision is made, you have folks who come down. We talk about building jobs. We talk about linking supply chain. We talk about connecting people from jobs to small business. And one of the things that's really impressive in our part of the world, Southeast Texas are like our cousins over there right with the Sabine River. So when we sneeze, they sneeze, we all catch cold. So what's really important is that you have this intermingling of culture, people, and a mindset. And then for really, really important, I want the committee to understand, Southeast Texas and Southwest Louisiana are still rebuilding from natural disasters that increased, what I want to say, it impacted how much people have lost. We've lost houses. We've lost job opportunities that have been had to move because people had to move out. So we're trying to build this thing back up. And LNG is a very, very, very important part of this piece. We're talking billions in money and in job opportunities.
I appreciate my time's gone over, so I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. I'll now go to Ms. Matsui for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all the witnesses for being here today. Natural gas has been hailed as a bridge fuel, replacing coal and providing backup power for renewables as we transition to 100% clean electricity. However, the value of natural gas as a bridge fuel is promised on the belief that gas is cleaner than coal and that the reliance on gas will be short-lived, with clean energy largely replacing natural gas by 2050. Burning natural gas emits roughly half the amount of CO2 that burning coal emits. However, if natural gas is released directly into the atmosphere and not burned, it becomes a very significant driver of global warming. This means that the value of natural gas as a replacement for coal depends on how much gas leaks directly into the atmosphere. Ms. Gianetti, can you describe where natural gas leaks occur across the supply chain and how prevalent these leaks are?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So the problem of gas leaks is a significant aspect to the question of the carbon intensity of gas and LNG. And unfortunately, they've been found to happen across the supply chain from the original extraction to transportation, both via pipeline and via ship, and actual regasification and use.
Okay. Do we really know how much methane is leaking into the atmosphere across the United States?
No, which is part of the reason why we need to update our studies to consider that.
Taking into account about these methane leaks, is there a point at which natural gas becomes worse for the planet than coal?
If you take in even minor gas leaks, the carbon footprint of gas can actually be worse than coal. But additionally, we're also looking at a bit of a misnomer here because it is questionable at best, especially looking at Europe, whether gas is even displacing coal.
Okay. Sending natural gas to Europe and Asia by ship requires the gas to be super cold and liquefied before being regasified at their destination. This is an energy-intensive process and also creates new opportunities for leakage. Ms. Gianetti, accounting for all of these processes, how does the emissions impact of liquefied natural gas compare to coal?
The climate impacts of the entire LNG value chain are enormous and need to be considered when factored into a public interest assessment, and they currently are not.
Okay. Clearly, the climate impact on natural gas depends on the degree of leakage. This is a solvable problem, though. The Inflation Reduction Act established a pollution fee for methane and provided funding to help detect leaks and reduce emissions. And in December, the Biden administration finalized a rule requiring oil and gas companies to detect and fix leaks and reduce intentional flaring. However, some in the oil and gas industry want to repeal this methane fee and roll back the recent rule on methane leaks. Ms. Gianetti, what would you say to those who claim natural gas is reducing emissions but refuse to address methane leaks?
If we want to take climate change seriously and have a real discussion about the impact of natural gas on that discussion, we cannot do so without focusing on methane leaks and trying to eliminate them to the maximum extent possible.
Okay. Even if LNG had lower lifestyle emissions and we knew it was replacing coal, the International Energy Agency has found that the current build-out of LNG export infrastructure is not compatible with the Paris Agreement goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Ms. Gianetti, can you describe how U.S. LNG export capacity compares to expected LNG demand if countries meet their Paris Agreement targets?
Currently, we are meeting Europe's demand. In fact, Europe has gas storage of 96%, which is some of the highest storage that it has ever had. Additionally, we expect our European allies to continue to transition away from gas as it revitalizes its system and improves energy efficiency. Accordingly, most studies strongly suggest that the LNG that we produce today and that we'll produce tomorrow, with this pause having no effect on them, will more than supply the European need.
So what would you say to the oil and gas industry about the future return on investment for new LNG export facilities?
Given that these facilities can last up to 40 years, it's an extremely risky investment to build LNG facilities in the 2030s.
So you're saying there'll be stranded assets?
It's a high risk of stranded assets. Yes, Congresswoman.
Okay, thank you, and I yield back.
Jillian yields back. I'll now go to Indiana's Dr. Bichon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know what to say. It's like we're in two different universes. Look, I support an all-the-above energy strategy. I think we should pursue everything, honestly. I really do. I also support Ukraine funding, as the vast majority of Republicans do. We also support, though, securing our southern border and preventing people from 160 different countries, including known terrorists, from coming across the southern border. And until this administration tries to address that, and we can get our colleagues on the other side of the aisle to realize that, we're going to be at a crossroads here. So it's a false narrative we don't support Ukraine. We do. We also support the people that we represent. It's a representative republic, and the people are telling me that they want to do both. Look, an indefinite pause is a ban. Make no mistake about it. And it's going to be lifted. It's going to be lifted in November of this year, after November 5th, or honestly on January 20th in 2025. This is about politics, and everybody in this room knows it. Thanks to American innovation in energy technologies, the United States is the world's largest producer of natural gas and exporter of LNG. A lot of this has been said. All the good questions have been asked, unfortunately. American LNG is a critical asset that not only keeps our energy sector secure and competitive, but also helps reduce global emissions, as has been described, and the global dependence on energy, and it's our dependence on global energy from adversarial nations, Russia. I've been in Japan recently. I've been in Poland recently in the last year. All you have to do is talk to people offline when you're not at some conference, sitting at the table, and just stand on the side and talk to people. And you want to talk about uncertainty amongst our allies? They are in a full-blown panic over this type of energy reaction in the United States for politics. I mean, that's not my opinion. I just hear that from those folks. U.S. energy sources are some of the cleanest in the world. We take the cleanest natural gas in the world out of the global market. I mean, trying to twist this around and in some way say that natural gas is dirtier than coal from China. I'm talking about coal from China and the way they produce it is just, I can't understand how that could happen. I mean, geopolitically, this decision by the White House is just foolish, economically also. So for Mr. Rice and Mr. McGowan, again, I know you've said this, but I mean, are our allies around the world going to turn to Russia, China, and Iran for natural gas if we don't produce it? And Qatar?
Congressman, it's important to realize that 2/3 of the world's natural gas is contained in 4 countries: Qatar, Iran, Russia, and the United States. So who's going to provide the energy security to the world? If the United States doesn't do it, should not be Russia, should not be Iran. Qatar, a little bit small. It has to be the United States to provide this energy security to the world.
Talk about the geopolitics also on this. Yeah.
Sure. I was just going to mention.
A lot of that.
We have letters from the Chamber, from Business Europe that have gone to the administration, from the Asian Natural Gas and Energy Association, from Japan, from others, from Eurogas. They're all aghast, literally, with what's going on. Yeah. It is a problem, and from the geopolitical implications, and by the way, it's not just coal, right? It's fuel oil, it's wood, it's other things that are being burned that are equally as worse, and Europe does burn all those things. But from a geopolitical standpoint, yes, there are only a few countries that do this, but they're going to go to the Qataris. They're going to go to others because for their energy security, they require regulatory certainty and stability as well.
Let me just say this: when we were I was in Eastern Europe about a year ago. Do you realize that the Russian propaganda in those countries is at a fever pitch, probably Cold War era or more? What are they saying? your government is causing you higher energy costs because they refuse to buy our natural gas that is cheaper than American natural gas. And guess what's happening? There are protests in those countries from people who live in those countries who happen to be communists. And they remember when the countries were Eastern Bloc, and their governments are under tremendous pressure to open up the spigot from Russia into their countries. If America backs away, they will be forced to do it. And guess what? It fuels Putin's war machine. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now go to my friend, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The question is to Ms. Gianetti. Will DOE's announcement impact approval of LNG exports to countries that have a free trade agreement with the United States?
No, Congressman, and the repeated references to this action as a ban, as a fan of The Princess Bride, makes me think of Inigo Montoya. They keep saying the word ban, but I don't think they know what it means.
Okay, well, clearly we're exporting record levels of LNG with even more capacity in the pipeline. If the Biden administration is trying to ban LNG exports, they're not doing a very good job, and that is because this is not a ban or a de facto ban either. It's an acknowledgement that export approvals have grown tremendously in recent years, meaning an increasing share of total U.S. production is being earmarked for export. I believe the responsible course of action is to take a breath and see if additional exports would continue to be in the public interest, and that should, of course, include an updated understanding of the impacts on U.S. consumers, the economy, the environment, and communities that host these facilities, amongst other factors. So, Ms. Gianetti, also, I don't want to clear something here that I've heard repeated by some of my colleagues across the aisle with suggestions that they're making. Given that the pause has no short or even medium-term impact on LNG exports, will there be a near-term impact on the price Russia gets for the gas today?
This pause has zero effect on all current LNG exports and all LNG exports that have already been approved by the Department of Energy, so it would be highly unlikely for there to be any of those effects.
And I would also ask about the myth versus fact document issued by the majority yesterday, which stated increasing LNG exports will also encourage investments in other industries like manufacturing, which will help ensure that we beat China. And honestly, I'm having a hard time making sense of this. So, Ms. Gianetti, do we currently export LNG to China?
Yes.
And with recent contracts, should we expect the volume of exports to China to increase in the future?
Yes, China is the single largest identifier purchaser of future natural gas, totaling almost 14%.
And what could LNG be used for in China? Is it potentially a lower cost input for China's manufacturing sector?
It could, yes, Congressman.
So, Ms. Gianetti, are there risks that unfettered LNG exports to China could undermine a potential advantage of American manufacturers?
Yes.
So time and time again, we've heard Republicans on this committee state their concerns about China leading in some strategic manufacturing sectors. And without an updated understanding of LNG exports' impacts, we could be further disadvantaging domestic companies. Personally, I believe we should be supporting U.S. manufacturers trying to compete for these industries of the future, as we have done in items like the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Trying to determine what is in the public interest is complicated, but we know it does not just mean what is good for fossil fuel executives. So I applaud the administration for taking the time to do this review and get it right. There's a lot of documentation that I think would serve us well as we move forward with the pause. So with that, I thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields. Chair recognizes Mr. Wahlberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I must say something initially here. It does bother me a bit to hear us challenged on this side of the aisle and not supporting Ukraine, when in fact we do support Ukraine. We've shown that in our votes. We also support securing our border, which is an awful important thing, I'd say to my Democrat colleagues,
that if you supported our border, we could join you in supporting Ukraine in the both.
Well, the gentleman
That
yield,
will
I got an
take place.
idea.
I don't have time right now. You know I don't state that angrily, but the bottom line, I'm sick of hearing us not supporting Ukraine. We do support that and have supported. You support the border, and we'll join together, I guess, in supporting Ukraine as well. Last week, I met with several delegations from around the world. They were here for the National Prayer Breakfast. I'll have to pray to get released from my anger right now. But in talking with them, they were here for the international portion of that prayer breakfast. A number of them expressed worry, literal worry and concern about President Biden's decision to indefinitely ban U.S. LNG exports and what it means for their energy, their security, their economy. I've got to say, with all due respect, uncertainty breeds insecurity. Uncertainty breeds insecurity, and that's not good for this time and place in our world. Energy security is national security, plain and simple. The Biden administration is turning their backs on our friends and allies abroad, not to mention American consumers and communities, in order to secure a few political points on their left flank, and this is what that's all about. Mr. McGowan, it seems short-sighted to me to upend an entire industry that millions depend on to appease environmental activists on TikTok. How important is policy stability for the global energy market, and what are the long-term national security consequences of this type of rapid policy shift?
Thank you very much for that question. They can be significant. Far too often, we make policy decisions in the short term without fully understanding the medium and long-term implications for these decisions. Private markets abhor risk. Capital deployment abhors risk. When you make these changes, when you're in the middle of the football game and the rules change, that translates to unacceptable risk. That then keeps capital on the sidelines. It keeps people from investing. It has people calling into question the regulatory regime, the regulatory certainty that is absolutely and fundamentally required in this and other areas.
Thank you, Mr. McGowan. I'll leave it there. Secretary Granholm has indicated that there will be exceptions to the White House's policy in the case of national, and I quote, national security emergencies. And their fact sheet claims that we will still be able to supply essential LNG to our allies in the near term. Are these exceptions and assurances sufficient to address global energy needs? Mr. McGowan, from the Energy Secretary.
No, they're not. I mean, you know, frankly, the damage has already been done. The way to undo this damage is admit that it was premature and reverse course. And I would like to see that, and that would be my recommendation to the administration. And at the same time, I think we could avoid gloating and say, okay, we all make mistakes, got it. You can pursue your studies, but upending the private market economy like this is terrible not only for America, but for our standing in the world. The ability just a year and a half ago, Secretary Blinken was saying, you can count on America. You can count on America's LNG. And here we are.
Yeah. Thank you. Mr. Cormier, are you hearing concerns like this from companies in your community, and what's the impact?
What we're hearing is constant panic simply because folks have built their plans for the future to hire people, to build restaurants, to build apartment complexes and housing. So it's a trickle-down effect. So folks are on standstill.
And they have contracts, right?
They have contracts. I know of someone right now who's worked on a project for over 12 years because it takes that much time to make these type of projects move forward. Friday morning, he called me and said, when am I supposed to do? And I had to sit and tell him, be patient, we're working on it.
And do I have to renew and go through the whole process again? It's frustrating to see this take place, and I hope we wake up to it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now go to Ms. Custer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to make clear for the record, Mr. Wahlberg, I'd ask unanimous consent to enter into The record today, the New York Times, Biden to make case for immigration and Ukraine aid bill. The president is expected to plead with Congress to pass a bill marrying an immigration crackdown to delivering emergency aid to Ukraine and Israel. Republicans have turned against the plan, likely dooming its chances. I ask unanimous consent.
We've sent them the plan already. Act on it.
We're just waiting for it to come to the floor. It's your speaker that refuses to bring it up. At the outset, I want to commend the Biden administration for its recent decision to pause new liquid natural gas export authorizations until it can evaluate if those LNG export authorizations are, and I quote, in the public interest. Today, the United States is the world's largest exporter of LNG, and between now and 2027, the United States is set to nearly double its LNG export capacity. One point I want to emphasize in this hearing is that LNG exports have a significant cost to American consumers. As Ms. Gianetti's testimony notes, over a 16-month period from September 21 through December 2022, LNG exports cost U.S. consumers more than $100 billion. This study is part of a growing body of evidence that demonstrates LNG exports increase domestic gas prices, driving up the costs of cooking, heating, and electricity for U.S. consumers and businesses. Ms. Gianetti, my first question is for you. How does the administration's announcement protect Americans from foreign gas buyers?
The administration's announcement allows it to be able to revise outdated and obsolete studies that do not factor in U.S. consumer impacts to make sure that those very real and serious impacts are being evaluated in determining whether a project is in the public interest.
Thank you. I want to put an even sharper point on your answer. Natural gas is the largest source of fuel for electricity generation in New England. When natural gas prices go up, so does the price of our electricity. My next question, again to you, I hope you can keep the answer brief. If the U.S. builds more natural gas export capacity, will electricity prices in New England increase as a result?
All of the evidence suggests that, yes, it would.
And I also want to talk about the economic reality of who truly benefits from LNG exports. As an illustrative example, Cheniere Energy, one of America's largest LNG exporters, in February 2016, Cheniere was the first American company to export LNG. At that point in time, its stock price was $30 per share. And today, with LNG exports at record high levels, Cheniere's stock is trading near an all-time high of $160 per share. While the market should reward innovation, risk-taking, and business acumen, lawmakers should be vigilant about who benefits from LNG exports and who pays the price, my constituents. Ms. Gianetti, do big fossil fuel companies like Cheniere benefit from increased natural gas exports while Americans, particularly in New England, pay more for electricity?
Exporting natural gas is a very profitable business for companies like Cheniere. Unfortunately, it can have a very disproportionate impact on gas-reliant consumers in the United States, particularly low income.
I represent my constituents who suffer from high energy prices, and I'm proud that President Biden is putting electricity customers in New Hampshire ahead of the interests of big fossil fuel companies and their share prices. And with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I'll now go to Mr. Palmer. No, Mr. Curtis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McCown, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I had an experience to travel to COP this year, and before I went, I noticed with great interest a delegate from Germany had circulated a letter, and some of our members in the House and Senate signed that would ban these LNG exports. So imagine my interest when I found myself in a room with her and heard her explaining how grateful she was that they had been able to move off Russian natural gas to U.S. natural gas. And I, of course, raised my hand and I said, can you help me understand why you don't want to allow others to do that? And she didn't have a good answer. And I'm just curious from your perspective, why is it that it's okay for Germany to brag about doing that, but then insist that others not have that opportunity?
Yes, that's a very good question, Vice Chair Curtis. Germany has always pursued their own version of Germany first policy when it comes to energy, and has for decades. They've decoupled geopolitical decisions with economic decisions. And, I've had the CEO of one of Germany's largest utility companies say, we didn't think we needed to worry about energy security. We didn't think it mattered. But there is this duplicity of thought in Germany that is inconsistent across what others do.
Can I ask you? This is only just speculation on my part, but I've thought perhaps, are there greenhouse gas emissions more today than they were before they started down this road?
They are, and the United States has reduced its GHG emissions
Dramatically.
dramatically through the shale revolution, whereas EU countries, and Germany in particular, has spent billions, if not trillions, of public money with other EU countries and have not
I would love to just hear more, but we're so limited on time. I am going to move us forward. Mr. Rice, can we discuss this concept a little bit? Sometimes it feels to me like people hate fossil fuels more than they hate emissions. As we talk about this cleanliness issue, it's my impression, and I've actually said it, and so tell me if I'm wrong, that we do produce it cleaner here than Russia, and not just by a little bit. Can you talk about that, and also this feeling like it's more important to kill fossil fuels than it is to kill emissions?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I can confirm that the energy that we produce here in America is the cleanest in the world. There's a lot of steps that EQT, America's largest natural gas producer, is taking that will actually bring the much-needed transparency, because we agree with our colleagues here from the NRDC, we need to take care of methane emissions, and we need to showcase that to the world. I am encouraged that the work, because I was at COP as well, and we heard climate leaders speak, specifically climate envoy John Kerry, saying that we have a choice, either eliminate fossil fuels or capture the emissions. That was a positive step for me, and fortunately, this industry is hearing the world's call for cleaner energy.
So would you agree with this statement, that we can keep energy prices low, that we can keep energy reliable, we can not just be energy independent, but energy dominant, and reduce emissions?
Yes, and we could look at the track record of success that the American oil and gas industry has laid. Keep in mind, 20 years ago, we were in a situation where we were energy dependent. We were thinking about importing gas. What happened? We cracked the code on shale, amazing innovation, and now we've turned America into an energy powerhouse. We've made the energy we produce in this country cheaper, more reliable. We hear the world's call for cleaner energy, and we are shifting that innovation towards making the energy we produce cleaner.
Thank you. Mr. Cormier, I represent a part of my district that is oil and gas. It's rural Utah. They often feel like we don't just demonize fossil fuels, we demonize the people. Is that something that you can connect with and have any experience with? And by the way, these are the same people who helped us win World War II, who make sure that when we go over the light switch, it flips on, and that we keep our homes at 70 degrees.
There's a sense of pride that the workers and the folks that live in our area have about being home to producing America's cleanest energy. In fact, we have worked on actually branding ourselves as a clean energy capital of the world, especially here in America. So when our folks get up in the morning, we're hardworking people, like a rural area.
Yeah.
That's what we do.
And I'm out of time, but I would love to just go on. Maybe we should initiate some sister city relationships, because my people are just like that, right? Hardworking, good people.
We'll switch and give you some boudin and some crawfish étouffée.
All right. I regret that I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Take some. I'll now go to Ms. Schreier, Dr. Schreier, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Duncan, and thank you to the witnesses who are here today. I would first just like to re-emphasize that my Republican colleagues are generating outrage based on what is, at best, a misunderstanding of facts. We are talking about a pause in permitting, not a ban. More than 14 billion cubic feet of liquefied natural gas is being produced every day, and more than twice of that capacity is already permitted. And DOE has already approved over 3 times our current export capacity. That is a whole lot of methane to meet near-term, even medium-term demand. So what this order does do is pause the permitting of new and pending LNG export applications and calls for a study to determine the climate and economic impacts of LNG exports as elements of the public interest, which has not been clarified. Since DOE has last examined the analysis of public interest, LNG exports have tripled. And as our tools and research for tracking life cycle emissions continues to advance, our emissions accounting looks grimmer and grimmer. Some studies even show that total greenhouse gas emissions of natural gas are worse than coal. So it's important that we take a step back while we are already miles ahead in LNG export capacity and fully understand the environmental and economic impacts as elements of the public interest. This is also a really good opportunity, as I'm focusing on emissions, it's a good opportunity to set the record straight on some of my colleagues' comments that the U.S. has decreased carbon emissions more than anywhere in the world because of this transition to methane. But carbon does not include methane, and methane is a more potent greenhouse gas. So the comment is really quite misleading, as leaks, even small leaks, will have a more detrimental impact. Ms. Gianetti, I'd like to ask you about what we know about how leaks contribute to the life cycle emissions of natural gas, of methane, and what does the latest evidence tell us about emissions and greenhouse warming?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. Leaks can offset any potential benefits of LNG and make it actually as bad as coal, if not worse. And unfortunately, we see leaks all along the value chain from initial extraction to transportation and use.
And we've been able to detect more of those leaks with recent technology, acknowledging that there are more of them. Now, as of 2023, we're the largest LNG exporter in the world. So pause or no pause, we should be doing everything in our power to reduce domestic life cycle emissions in our existing natural gas infrastructure. And I was proud to pass the methane emissions reductions program, and I'm glad to see the EPA announce a new rule to curb methane emissions from this sector. It is important to note, I think, as many of my colleagues have pointed out, that the U.S. can only impact leaks at home and not abroad. Can you talk about both the values of the initiatives we've taken here in the U.S. and perhaps about what we need to think about as we consider the entire supply chain and where those leaks might happen, even though they might not happen in the U.S.?
There are critical measures that we have started to take and that we need to continue to take to improve the efficiency and reduce leakage domestically. Unfortunately, as you mentioned, Congresswoman, it is impossible for us to regulate those leakage rates abroad, which can contribute significantly to the overall carbon footprint of LNG export. And of course, because air is transparent, the air that is polluted from those leakage rates overseas does affect us here in the United States as well.
Thank you. So I just wanted to emphasize that we are talking about emissions and we are talking about greenhouse gases and climate change, and emission-free options, whether it is nuclear, hydropower, solar, wind, they need to be more of a larger energy mix, and we should encourage other countries to move toward that path as well. And we do need to be mindful about energy security and not turn off sources until we have developed new ones. But there is no urgency, and this pause seems appropriate to me. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and I now go to Mr. Palmer from Alabama for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to respond in regard to whether or not this is a pause or a ban. It takes years to get permits. for an LNG facility. There are billions of dollars in capital investment involved. And what's really happening here is this administration understands that. They don't understand a whole lot about science, but they understand a whole lot about politics and permitting. And I think they're deliberately creating uncertainty about permit approval. I mean, the Department of Energy in December announced that the project's not yet operational. Will have to reapply for the permits if their permit was approved more than 7 years ago. That's billions of dollars in investments that could go down the drain. But they've created uncertainty in order to stifle investment and to discourage foreign governments from entering into contracts with companies that might not be able to provide the product. So in regard to whether it's a pause or a ban, it's a ban. I want to ask, point out a couple of things. One, we probably saved countless numbers of lives in Europe over the last couple of years because we've been able to provide LNG. Even with that said, because of the move to renewables in Europe and their reliance on Russian gas, 68,000 Europeans died last winter in what was a relatively mild winter because they couldn't afford to adequately heat their homes. These are people with cardiovascular respiratory issues. And I've repeated this time and time again. It gets no response from the other side. Same things happened in the UK. But what I want to get into is, Mr. McCown, in your testimony, you made the comment about this being a national security issue. I think it is. It absolutely is. You even mentioned something that doesn't get mentioned around here very often, that America is the arsenal of democracy. I think a significant part of that arsenal is our enormous energy capacity to aid our allies and emerging economies. Would you like to comment on that briefly?
Yes, thank you very much. It is, and you know, we have always been the supplier. I mentioned mentioned earlier today that we supplied most of the oil and gas used during World War II. You know, we export a lot of things that is very helpful, and we do it in an environmentally friendly way. We are more highly regulated than almost any other country in the world, and we do it safely. Mm-hmm. And by removing that, what we are going to see is increases in emissions from around the world, not decreases. And I think it's something we have to take very seriously.
But you also understand that China is an adversary. And I've told people this many times, the war in Ukraine didn't create the energy crisis, it exposed it. And the thing that everybody should learn from that is that no nation should be reliant on an adversarial nation for something as critical to its economy and its national security as energy. You see what's happening right now is that you've got a number of non-government organizations and nonprofit groups pushing for an energy transition in the United States, and they did the same thing in Europe, being funded by Russian and Chinese dollars. And
yes, that's true. And, you know, the transition is not an overnight occurrence. I think we all agree we want clean, cheap, affordable, and responsible fuel sources. The issue of pushing a premature transition upends our economic and national security. We need I'm an all-the-above kind of guy, but we need a responsible pathway toward net zero.
Well, I worked for 2 international engineering companies, did everything from environmental systems to refuse to energy to aerospace. And there's some fundamental physics involved in an energy transition that apparently my colleagues across the aisle do not understand. We're not going to get to net zero by 2050 under any scenario. It's not possible. What we will do is wreak unimaginable destruction on the American economy. And going back to what's happened in Europe in the UK in 2008, they wanted to be the model for shifting to renewables. They wanted to be set the model for Europe. Well, in terms of peacetime economic growth, their growth is the slowest since 1780. That's not 1980 or 1880. That's 1780, the year before Yorktown. And that's where we're heading. And just one, Mr. Chairman, just one point here. Venture Global's Gulf Coast CP2 would supply about 5% of the world's LNG by 2026. That would have a bigger impact on the U.S. economy than any green energy project. It would produce about $600 billion in revenue over the lifespan of the project, thousands of jobs, and reduce greenhouse emissions by 140 million tons a year. I cannot imagine for the life of me why we've got groups funded by Chinese money and Russian money that they're really about reducing emissions when I'm really concerned it's really about a threat to our national security. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Before I recognize the next person, I want to ask you to help me welcome a Special Olympics medalist, a good friend of mine, Rachel Lewis, in the back of the room. Rachel's here for Special Olympics Advocacy Day. Welcome, Rachel. I'll now recognize Mr. Sarbanes for 5 minutes.
It's not fair, Mr. Chairman, to have to follow Rachel now, but welcome. LNG terminals impact the communities in which they are located. We've heard about economic opportunity, as well, of course, as communities that use the LNG that passes through them. But there's a lot of ways in which communities are impacted. There's jobs, there's the environmental impacts, and other things that need to be considered. And DOE's pause in considering pending LNG export permits is not going to affect current operations at places like Cove Point LNG terminal, which is just south of my district in Maryland. But it will allow the department, rightly, to reassess the economic and environmental analysis it uses to better determine if future LNG exports will be a net benefit, considering everything to all affected communities. In other words, if they are in the public interest. And certainly one critical measure of whether LNG exports are in the public interest is if these exports help or conversely harm our efforts to meet our local, domestic, and international policy goals, such as our climate commitments. Two asides quickly. One is the notion that this is politics to have this pause where DOE is trying to bring more things into the picture, I think is unfair. I mean, we're at the beginning of the second year of a 2-year term that members of Congress serve in. If we're going to have to swear off the whole second year of our 2-year terms in terms of being able to take steps or endorse or support this kind of agency activity because we're in a campaign year and therefore it's political, we're losing half of our capacity to do our jobs as members of Congress and as people in these responsible federal agencies. So I take the administration at its word that it's just trying to incorporate broader perspective into the way these decisions are being made. And frankly, it's a sign of the maturing or the maturity of the industry, too, that you would have a pause. I mean, this LNG industry's been moving forward pell-mell, to their credit, with a lot of benefits associated with it. There's tremendous capacity in the permits that already exist that aren't being interrupted here. To say, let's pause and examine all of the kind of externalities and other factors that need to go into this, that's, in some ways, that's a nod to the industry that we understand you're here to stay in many respects, and therefore, these other factors need to be considered. So I don't view it as an attack on the industry, frankly. The state of Maryland has a climate pollution reduction plan that targets net zero emissions by 2045. As we know, the Biden administration's greenhouse gas reduction target aims to have nationwide emission levels by 2030 relative to 2005 levels. At COP28 in Dubai, the US and nearly 200 other countries committed to transitioning away from fossil fuels and cutting methane emissions. Ms. Gianetti, can you please explain how US LNG exports impact our ability to meet these climate targets at all levels? How do you anticipate, if you do, that the Biden administration's pause will have a positive impact on our work to meet these policy goals, both at home and abroad? And again, we're trying to get to these goals because they mean something, and we understand the implications of not getting there. And there's lots of industries, not just the LNG industry, that are needing to be brought into that broader way of thinking here. So if you could speak to whether you think the pause can positively impact the progress we're trying to make towards these larger goals.
The pause is a critical step to ensuring that the criteria we are using when evaluating far future LNG exports incorporate the known climate and economic impacts of those exports. If all proposed projects were built, the U.S. would overshoot its climate targets by 41%, and 67 members of European parliaments have actually written a letter congratulating the Biden administration on this pause and specifically stating that they do not want to be used as a pawn by the fossil fuel industry to continue to build exports that are not going to be used for their daily security needs.
Thanks very much. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now go to Ms. Lesko from Arizona for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to say I have a lot of eye rolling going on over here, so I apologize. I have to deal with bad decisions this administration makes on a daily basis, but stopping the progress of building U.S. LNG terminals is just simply an irrational decision. I cannot imagine a worse conceived idea that is more detrimental to reducing worldwide greenhouse gas emissions, and it also decreases world energy security and U.S. national security. President Biden claims he wants to reduce emissions. Banning LNG exports does the opposite. Let's start off with some facts from Biden's own Department of Energy, his own Department of Energy. The U.S. has been the world leader in lowering carbon emissions. How did we do it? Primarily by substituting natural gas for coal power generation. We reduced our power sector emissions by 36%, over 1 billion metric tons of CO2. By 2050, worldwide coal consumption will increase from 8 billion tons to 9 billion tons, an increase of over 1 billion tons. If the Biden administration would do the smart thing and increase LNG exports to Europe, India, and Asia, we can help them reduce their coal consumption by the same percent, which would be 3 billion metric tons, and reduce CO2 emissions many billions of tons. It's a common sense and easy task to substitute U.S. natural gas for Russian natural gas that continues to flow to our allies in NATO and the EU. Russian natural gas exported to Europe has a life cycle emissions profile 41% higher than U.S. LNG exported to Europe. If the European Union switched all of their natural gas imports to 2021 from Russia to the U.S., emissions would have been reduced over 218 million tons over the course of its life cycle. Biden has waged a war on American energy while ignoring the fact that even his own Energy Information Agency has said global demand for energy will increase by 50% between now and 2050. Embracing cleaner U.S. technology, U.S. resources, and free market principles is what allowed the U.S. to reduce emissions while ensuring reliable and affordable energy. President Biden and his administration have consistently opposed American energy development. Rather than restricting domestic energy and mineral production, we need to unlock American resources to provide energy security here at home and for our allies abroad. Mr. Rice, this so-called pause was a political decision taken by DOE, given that DOE has now politicized a process that is clearly in our national interest, and FERC is supposed to be an independent and not subject to pressure from the White House or the Department of Energy. Do you think this committee should consider revoking DOE's review for these projects and give sole authority to FERC?
I would defer to you on what you think is best, but I would give this perspective for you to consider. The pipeline cancellations that have taken place in this country, and the pushback has obviously shown that there is a sign, there's a need for us to take actions to reform the permitting process, and hopefully we can get it right, because without it, we're on the brink of another energy crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Mr. McCown, Mr. Pallone earlier said exporting more LNG from the United States will help China. Can you give your thoughts on that comment?
Yeah, well, with China building a coal-fired power plant every other week, couple of weeks, it's hard to see how that's the case. And what's curious to me is if we care about emissions, we should be talking about China and India a whole lot more and less to the United States. But U.S. LNG abroad is reducing greenhouse gas emissions through substitution of not only coal, but other even higher intensity burning products.
Thank you. And Mr. McCown, I've been told Germany is very upset that we are doing this so-called pause on LNG permits because, quite frankly, they were promised by the Biden administration that we were going to help them if they got rid of Russian national gas. Is that what you understand, and what are your thoughts on that?
That is what I understand as well. And let's remember that Germany runs on natural gas, not renewables just yet.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Only yields it back. I'll now go to Mr. Cardenas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Duncan and Ranking Member DeGette, for holding this important hearing. And I appreciate the opinions of the witnesses and you sharing your expertise with us. Under the Natural Gas Act, Congress required the Department of Energy to ensure that LNG shipments to non-free trade agreement countries are in the public's interest. This requirement was intended to put Americans and the communities we represent first. However, guidance on how the department makes the determination on what is in the public's interest has not been reviewed in over 40 years. Not only that, but the data that the department has been using in its analysis is outdated and inadequate. The administration's recent pause on LNG exports is an opportunity for the department to conduct a long overdue analysis to better reflect updated climate and economic realities that face our nation and the world. As a result, this process will allow for a more accurate determination on what is in Americans' best interest, including the people who will be most affected by these consequences. Ms. Gianetti, we know that LNG terminals burden the communities that host them. This has been made clear by science, federal court decisions, and what we have heard directly from communities. In your testimony, you said that the LNG exports have critical environmental justice impacts that DOE does not currently analyze. Can you explain how the DOE currently considers the short and long-term impacts of LNG exports on frontline communities, if at all? And even if the DOE doesn't currently consider them, can you talk about the impacts that these LNG terminals have on frontline communities?
Thank you, Congressman. The Department of Energy does not consider environmental justice impacts of LNG export to date. That is part of the reason why it is important to update the criteria by which we do a public interest assessment. LNG can have a significant impact on environmental justice. The terminals are by and large built in communities that are disproportionately minority communities and lower income. It can cause issues with asthma, respiratory illnesses, and release of toxic compounds into the air. And these impacts have extremely serious effects that can compromise the vitality and economic security of the regions that are directly affected. Environmental justice is one of the most important issues that we need to look at today, and unfortunately, the department currently doesn't do that.
Thank you very much. Ms. Gianetti, how will the administration's pause enable the DOE to better incorporate environmental justice impacts into its decisions, and why is this reassessment potentially a big step forward for environmental justice?
The pause enables the department to not only work with scientific studies and with the own national labs, but also to solicit feedback from community members that are affected by LNG development to ensure that we are properly accounting the disproportionate impact on environmental justice communities.
Thank you. Unfortunately, throughout this Congress, Republicans have built upon a decade-long effort to remove public interest determinations from LNG exports. If Republicans were successful in their efforts, only FERC would need to approve LNG export terminals. Can you talk about why this would be concerning, given FERC's recent history of ignoring climate and environmental justice impacts in its certificates under the Natural Gas Act?
Thank you, Congressman. I'll first note that FERC is also subject to the public interest determination under the Natural Gas Act. So FERC also is required to look at all elements of the public interest in determining whether a project should be approved. Therefore, the concerns about whether the public interest is properly being assessed affect both the department and FERC. To date, FERC has failed to properly account for the climate, economic, and environmental justice impacts of LNG infrastructure. There are some reasons to potentially be hopeful that that could change, but so far we haven't actually seen anything happen.
Thank you. One of the original reasons why I ran for office almost 30 years ago was because I grew up in a neighborhood where all of the dump sites in Los Angeles were on my side of town. And the power plants to this day still exist on my side of town. But it's really interesting, though that trash and that energy goes to all towns, all sides of the towns in my community. But yet, on the west side of Los Angeles, you don't find these facilities, yet we service all of them. So equities is very important, and these reviews are very important too. With that, my time having expired, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now go to the gentleman from Houston, Texas, where they know how to export energy. Mr. Weber for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get started, I'm going to ask unanimous consent. I have 4 letters from Port Arthur, Texas, which, as you know, is West Louisiana. Mr. Cormier, Senator, you bet. And they're from the Chamber of Commerce, the county judge, from the president of Lamar College, and also from Port Arthur Chamber of Commerce, Lamar State College, Mayor of Port Arthur, and from the county judge. So enter them into the record.
Without objection to order.
Thank you. Mr. Cormier, I'm going to come to you. I'm a little put out with you. You offered to give somebody boudin and crawfish etouffee, but you didn't say nothing about gumbo.
You wanted chicken and sausage or shrimp and crab?
Well, both, all 3 of them. Well, my bride of 47 years grew up in a little town called Nederland over there by Beaumont. So we watch Southeast Texas, or Southwest Louisiana, if you will. You said if one of us sneezes, the other catches cold. We appreciate what y'all are doing. Port Arthur has been the victim of a blight. And so what's happening with Sempra Energy and others, not just Sempra, but others in Port Arthur, Texas, Southeast Texas as we call it, is actually helping with the community, helping rebuild the community, that city. You know, I've got the 4 coastal counties of Texas, starting at Louisiana border, going down the down the curve of Texas. We have 7 ports, more than any other member of Congress. Some have 4. We produce 65% of the nation's jet fuel, 80% of the nation's military-grade fuel. Energy for us is a big, big deal. I'm going to segue over to you real quick, Ms. Gianetti, if I can. If, in fact, the LNG is capable of helping to lower greenhouse gas emissions in the world, that would be a good thing. Yes or no, it would be a good thing if it does it.
One of the reasons why we need to properly reassess our tools is to be able to evaluate the impact of LNG.
Either
on carbon emissions.
LNG does a good job of reducing versus when you're talking about coal, you're talking about oil, you're talking about other things. LNG helps reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I got to move on. I'm short of time. Back to you, Mr. Cormier. Can you elaborate on the jobs from your vantage point, both direct and indirect, the tax revenues, and all that these LNG export? And by the way, I didn't say we have 2 LNG plants in our district. We have Freeport LNG, and we have we have Golden Pass LNG, Sempra on the boards. And as you know, Cheniere is right across the road from Sabine Neches Waterway. And Sabine Neches Navigation District has a contract to export their LNG out. So we in Texas are responsible for a lot of that. Tell us about both direct and indirect impact on jobs, the tax revenues, and all that these LNG export facilities bring home. Tell us about that.
This is directly from McNeese State University's H.C. Drew Center for Economic Development. In terms of completed and operating LNG facilities, construction resulted in impacts of almost 17,000 jobs, over $1.2 billion in labor income, almost $1.5 billion in real GDP. Operations resulted in annual impacts of over 3,000 jobs, almost $350 million in labor income, and over $1 billion in real GDP. In terms of the announced LNG facilities, construction will result in impacts of over 25,000 jobs, almost $2 billion in labor income, over $2 billion in real GDP, and operations would result in almost 4,000 jobs, almost $440 million in labor income, and over $1.3 billion in real GDP. That's the numbers that we have locally.
And that says a whole lot, that we're doing a good job as creating jobs. It is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, whether some here want to admit that or not. Mr. McCown, I'm going to jump over to you. In your testimony, you lay out the path forward for counties that rely on U.S. LNG if this export ban remains. And this is an election year, and let's make no, it's funny that our friends across the aisle want to talk about, we're making it a thing for whether it's Ukraine funding and blah, blah, blah. This is an election year. Can you speak to the environmental benefits that U.S. LNG provides, especially as it compares to producers worldwide? I've got about 35, 40 seconds.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it significantly reduces greenhouse gas emissions, and we talk a lot about coal, which is about a 50% emission reduction, but when we talk about fuel oil, wood, other things, it's
dung.
I wasn't going to say it, but yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, and we appreciate that. And let's see, in the last 19 seconds, Mr. Rice, energy security is national security. What are you doing to help with it? You got 10 seconds.
We are promoting the Unleash U.S. LNG, I think is calling that out as the biggest green initiative on the planet, which it is, to make sure that everybody understands the key to lowering global emissions and increasing energy security is the same answer.
Appreciate what you do, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chairman yields back. We'll stay in Texas and go to Ms. Fletcher for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses for your insights today. This issue is important, and I am glad that we're having this hearing. Obviously, sitting through all of this hearing, I have a lot to say, but only 5 minutes to do it, so I'm going to be quick and be on time. Look, I agree with a lot of the comments that have been made today about the benefits of U.S. LNG, and those of us in Houston, which I'm proud to represent, and all along the Gulf Coast have a lot to say about them. I've also heard several things that I disagree with today, and I'm going to first take a minute to disagree with what we heard from Chairwoman McMorris Rodgers and others, and the very title of this hearing, that last week's announcement from the Biden administration is an export ban. It's not. Several people have made that observation today too, but as we know, it is a temporary pause on the approval of export permits at DOA while it reviews and updates its public interest determination process. I think Ms. Gianetti explained the process very well in her testimony, so thank you for that very clear explanation of what is involved. But certainly what we've seen is that this pause has caused concern and uncertainty in industry and in communities. And I think this is really an opportunity for us to focus on that. But I think that it's really not helpful to our efforts to call it a ban, because then we're not talking about what's really happening, and we're not talking about what we should do next. As I see it, this is an opportunity to address what I see are the three principal issues that are driving this, that have been raised as concerns today: climate, cost, and communities. Those are the three things that I think we're talking about. I think it's also an opportunity to address some of the issues and get the market in order, addressing issues of supply, ensuring confidence of our European allies and others, and enforcing our existing permits. So, as I said, I disagree with the framing. I also disagree with some of the things we've heard today about costs for consumers and the effects of LNG on domestic prices. A 2012 report from the Obama administration found that U.S. economic welfare consistently increases as the volume of natural gas exports increases, and that includes scenarios on which there are unlimited exports. So I think that's really important to note when we're talking about costs for consumers. Since 2016, when LNG exports began in earnest, the Henry Hub natural gas spot price has remained stable, and it's an average of $2.5 per million BTU. So we simply have not seen a domestic price impact at this point, and I think that that is an important part of our conversation. I'm hopeful that DOE in its review of the data will reach these same findings that multiple administrations and both parties have found, that exporting LNG is in the public interest. LNG exports, as we've discussed today, really ensure a future that is marked by affordable, accessible, reliable, and sustainable energy that promotes global stability at a moment when we desperately need it, and advances the energy transition. And these are things that we're very focused on in Houston. Houston is the energy capital of the world. We touch every part of what is going on in LNG and in other areas. And so while we've touched on it already, I really do think it bears repeating that it's only been 8 years since the United States began exporting LNG, and we have become the world's top exporter of natural gas. And the growth that we've seen from the shale revolution really has powered our economy and increased our national security. And it's not just ours, as we know, it's critical for our allies' security. There's been a lot of discussion about impacts in Europe and the impacts in Ukraine in particular. And I want to associate myself with the comments of our ranking member DeGette on the issues facing Ukraine in this moment and the importance of American leadership, both in energy exports as well as in securing aid to our allies and partners in Europe. I also will note that this is why I introduced the American Gas for Allies Act in the last Congress, which would extend the automatic public interest determination to countries where we don't have a free trade agreement, but we would include NATO members. And I really hope this committee will consider it if we can. But I don't have a lot of time left for my questions, so I'm going to submit them for the record. But as I said, I really see these three pillars of the challenges in front of us. And one of the ones that I really want to focus on is the impact on communities. There's a lot of work we can do here. Just because we have cleaner American natural gas that's more competitive on the world market doesn't mean that our work to reduce emissions and safeguard our communities where that gas is exported from or developed is complete. We really need to engage and make sure that communities neighboring these facilities are confident that their needs are being met, that their concerns are being addressed in the permitting process, and I think there's an opportunity here to do that. And so I'm going to submit questions for the record, Ms. Gianetti, and also Mr. Cormier. I specifically want to address them to you. I have a couple others that I will send to y'all, but I do really appreciate hearing from you all today, and I appreciate the time. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Generally yields back. I now go to Ohio's Mr. Balderson for 5 minutes. Hold on, Troy. Okay. Mr. Balderson, recognized for 5 minutes. You fine with that? Okay. Mr. Griffith, recognized for 5 minutes. Let's go.
All right, sorry, as I think Ms. DeGette said earlier, she parachuted into my hearing. I've now parachuted into your hearing, and I apologize to all of you for not having been here the whole time, but I've been upstairs along with others in another subcommittee hearing. So, Mr. Rice, my colleague mentioned that that what the White House position was of last week or the last 10 days or so was not a ban, but merely a pause as they study things. But am I not correct that the world is looking to the U.S. for more and more natural gas to supplant other natural gas providers or just to supplant other fuels?
Yes, I mean, regardless of whether you call it a pause, a ban, it has a chilling impact on investors. It has a chilling impact on our ability to get these projects built. And it has not stopped the desire for more energy from the United States. Just yesterday, the UK signed up for a 3 million ton per annum deal with Venture Global on the CP2 facility. So all it's done is create a lot of confusion in the marketplace, and quite frankly, is appearing to be not necessary.
And doesn't that confusion lead to an instability in the reliance on American natural gas?
I mean, confusion is going to cause people that have expected to the security from the United States to look elsewhere. And it's a lost opportunity for us and something that we're going to have to reassure our allies that we are here to help provide energy security, because your energy security is our energy security.
And if they start looking elsewhere because we have instability or we're not reliable to provide them not only what we're currently giving them, but additional natural gas, what choices do they have other than us or Russia? I mean, I know there's a couple of small actors, but aren't we the big actors, United States and Russia?
I mean, the United States is the largest, but we do need to understand we do not control the market. There are other options, and some of these options may not be as friendly to the United States as we'd like. Russia, Iran are two other large producers of gas that have a lot of potential. And the other big alternative that people can run into is foreign coal. So whether we have an energy security issue or we start having emissions rising, I mean, that's what's happening. If the United States does not supply this LNG, that means there's going to be more coal.
So if we get a request from India and we can't provide it, they'll burn their coal, which is not nearly as clean as the coal in my district. Isn't that true?
That's absolutely correct. And I think that's the biggest thing that people need to understand. Less LNG means more coal. Less LNG does not mean more renewables. It simply means more coal and higher emissions.
And we talked about how when we started, and we had an example here in Congress, when we started exporting oil again, the prices didn't go up. My colleague from Texas just talked about how people worried when we started exporting LNG that, our prices would go up, and they've been relatively stable. But if we don't export, do you think prices might go up, as opposed to the reverse, which most people would think is that if we export more, prices would go up. But in reality, that instability in the market stops exploration or stops new wells from being committed to, and therefore doesn't that actually have the inverse effect?
Yeah, let me give you an example. I mean, it's real simple for me. Exports means surplus, and surplus means lower volatility, protection from price shocks. Listen, the world is energy short, and as you've seen what happened with Russia and Ukraine, and Europe's energy security had trickle impacts over to us in the United States. So what happens around the world is going to impact us. How do we protect ourselves? More exports, create more surplus here in America, and exports are the only reason for us to create that surplus. How can this help us respond to high prices? Right now, by the time I push the button on my desk to add rigs to go out and add, if I see a price signal, it takes 18 months to go and make sure that production hits the market to help relieve prices. In an unleashed U.S. LNG scenario where that production is flowing through our pipelines to supply an export market, we can divert that production and respond to that price signal in 18 hours. That's how we keep prices low from everybody and protect Americans from really the big problem, which is the really volatile price shocks. Exports are going to be the key to providing the surplus and keeping energy secure here for Americans.
Appreciate you being here today, and I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now go to Mr. Vesey from Texas, 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, thank you very much, and I want to thank the panel for being here today. As you know, these discussions that we have around energy become very contentious. I like to compare them as a lifelong Fort Worth native. I could almost compare them to the same sort of tension that we see every twice a year when the Eagles and the Cowboys play each other. It's almost like that sort of black and white, but we know that it's really not that black and white, that this is a very complicated story, that it's not an easy story. For many, the way that it's presented to the media and to organizations and what have you is presented as easy, simple, binary, black and white choices, but this is some complicated stuff, and I've been a proponent of LNG exports because I do think that they hold significant benefits for the U.S., our economy, our energy security, and in addition to our energy security, our efforts to combat climate change, because the energy security piece and the climate change piece go hand in hand. You absolutely cannot separate them. They go hand in hand, and so I hope that we can move the needle more in that direction and start moving the discussion more in that direction. We have a long way to go, obviously, but it's something that I think the world needs to start embracing. That's one of the reasons why I led a letter with my Democratic colleagues, urged the White House to refocus policies that support continued LNG exports. And while we're here today, we cannot forget that we are making great investments to reduce methane emissions from the oil and gas sectors as well. The IRA provided $1.5 billion for grants, rebates, contracts, loans to support emission monitoring and methane reduction efforts. This is coupled with the proposed waste emissions charge and Subpart W revisions from EPA aimed at getting real empirical emission data. And all of this suggests that along with the incentives for other forms of cleaner energy passed in the IRA, we should consider environmental benefits of U.S. gas production and exports to already be a part of the strong geopolitical and domestic reasons for greater gas production in the near term. And so I hope that the administration pauses, but I'm confident that this ensuing study will demonstrate the clear merits of LNG exports. And I wanted to ask Ms. Gianetti, what happens after a company receives an export license? Is there significant regulation or oversight once someone has received a license to ensure that all exporters are abiding by the terms set forth in the license or contracts?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. Typically, in an approval from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, there will be a variety of expectations and requirements that the LNG terminal is expected to meet.
Okay. I wanted to ask Toby Rice, you stated in your 2022 10K filing that you do not believe that EQT will be subject to EPA's waste emission charge. Now that EPA has released its proposal, do you still believe that to be the case? And if so, can you elaborate on how EQT is going to meet that 0.2% threshold?
Specifically, what regulation are you talking about again?
It's the EQT and the 10K filing. It says that EQT will not be subject to EPA's waste emission charge.
Sure. Yeah, so EQT, the reason why we won't be subject to a penalty is because our methane emissions will be so much better from a performance perspective than the limit set by the EPA. For perspective, you know, we've reduced our methane emissions by 70% in just the last 18 months. We did it quickly, cost effectively, and our methane emissions are going to be about 10 times better performing than the EPA limits. Shows you the power of modern shale development.
Okay, and let me ask you this real quick while I still have a couple of seconds left. Even if you're not subject to the charge, you support EPA's methane emissions reduction program, including the waste emissions charge, Subpart W revisions, and the reporting requirements.
EQT has been supportive of methane regulation and refreshing that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now go to Mr. Balderson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing today. Thank all of you from the panel for being here today. Mr. McCown, I do have to say I have 2 Red Hawks in my office. Glad to see someone from Miami, University of Ohio here, so thank you for being here. Mr. Rice, thank you for being here today. You mentioned that over the past few years, EQT has averaged nearly $1 billion in payments to Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania landowners. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. If the ban on LNG exports remains in place, how will that impact the benefits of those communities are seen from natural gas production?
It would mean a reduction in those royalty payments, specifically because we would not have the need to produce more to fill the export demand.
Thank you. Mr. Cormier, thank you for being here, sir. Would you like to add anything on how this ban would impact communities in Louisiana?
It impacts business decisions, whether from the LNG companies, but everyone else under that. Again, I want to reemphasize, business decisions are made by people planning with certain degrees of expectation. Lastly, what I would like to do, I would invite the whole committee to Lake Charles, Louisiana, Cameron Parish, so you can see exactly the impact, the positive impact, the things that are going on in our community as we build from the disasters that we've dealt with, along with how this industry is very important in making us become stronger, because we're strong people and we like working and making things happen and moving forward.
Thank you. I've seen the impacts of the shale revolution firsthand. It's been an absolute game changer in Appalachia, Ohio. Mr. Rice, thank you. I'm well aware of what you have done in southeastern and eastern Ohio. And just recently, the Muskingum Watershed Conservancy District, which covers most of my congressional district, released a report showing revenues from Utica shale leases have raised the region's economy by nearly $1 billion. When I look at the lifeline that natural gas is, given my district and the Appalachia, Ohio, it makes the Biden administration's decision even more puzzling. Mr. Rice and Mr. McCown, I'll go with Mr. Rice first. I understand that a new major Russian LNG export facility is scheduled to come online this year. At the same time, Iran is hoping to complete a new LNG export facility next year. Is that correct, Mr. Rice?
There are multiple LNG facilities across the entire world that the United States is competing with.
Okay. Mr. McCown, in 2022, 64% of the U.S. LNG exports went to Europe. And last year, only 10% of Europe's natural gas needs were met by domestic productions. I apologize, this is from Mr. Rice. Mr. Rice, despite increased U.S. LNG exports to Europe in recent years, is Europe still burning Russian LNG and Russian natural gas delivered by pipelines?
Russia still is consuming, Europe is still consuming Russian energy.
Did you want to add anything to that, Mr. McCown?
No, that's completely accurate. So Russia is still getting money out of Europe to conduct its war activities in Ukraine.
Thank you. Do either of you think, Mr. Rice and Mr. McCown, do either of you think it's America's best interest for Europe to continue relying on Russia to meet its energy needs? Mr. McCown, I think you just answered it, but is that correct?
No, of course it's not.
Thank you. Mr. Rice?
I would say that ultimately it's up to Europe to determine where they need to get their energy from, but as we've seen, they prefer American resources, and America has the ability, the resource to replace Russian energy on the world market when we're talking about natural gas.
Okay, I'll just go with one more question, Mr. Rice. You mentioned that EQT has cut methane intensity by roughly 70% since 2019. Can you discuss specifically, we talked a little bit about it from the last question, what steps your company has taken to reduce methane emissions and enhance operational efficiencies?
Sure, I'll be very brief. Number one, massive operational efficiencies from being able to drill faster. That has happened across the entire industry. You see, we used to run 2,000 rigs. Now we're having record productions with just 600 rigs. Second thing is pinpointing, is electrifying the oil field, replacing diesel equipment with natural gas equipment. Third thing is replacing pneumatic devices for natural gas is the biggest source of equipment. For methane emissions, we've pulled all 9,000 of those out in less than 18 months for a cost of less than $10 per ton. It's important to understand that these opportunities that we're doing at EQT to lower our methane emissions are available for other natural gas operators, and we are working open source with operators to showcase to the world that methane emissions will be knocked out of the park.
Thank you for what you've been doing, and thank you, everybody, for being here. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now go to the gentlelady from Florida that both imports and exports natural gas, Ms. Castro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, it's only been since 2016 that Congress authorized the export of fossil gas. It's grown exponentially. It has had some positive benefit of displacing dirty coal. But I think now looking out to the future, as the estimates are that the exports could double, it is an appropriate time for the administration to take a hard look on the what the impacts are going to be. Is it going to continue to raise prices on my folks back home? Because my neighbors in the Tampa area, we are being socked. Our electric bills, primarily tied to gas, are out of sight. Is it going to create additional environmental risks for the people of the Gulf Coast? What does it mean for our national security? I'm sure that unfettered exports are great news for gas companies. They will benefit. But really, what impact does it have on American families and on our national security and pollution? And especially as we know that a lot of these exports go to China. I serve on a select committee on kind of confronting the Chinese Communist Party. Is this going to fuel what they're doing right now? Ms. Gianetti, do U.S. LNG companies send a significant amount of their product to China?
Yes, currently China ranks around 7th in overall, but in terms of future LNG exports, it is the single largest identified consumer, amounting to up to 14%.
It's interesting that so many seem so eager to fuel Chinese industry without weighing potential energy and national security risks. And Ms. Gianetti, how does the LNG boom impact energy bills for American families? And do you think the massive growth of exports has contributed to U.S. inflation by raising energy costs for American families?
Energy costs are one of the most important things for American pocketbooks. And as we have seen, when there is an increase in exports, it has a disproportionate impact on gas-reliant energy consumers and raises energy bills. So it has a negative impact on the U.S. public interest in the U.S. economy.
And I have one study in front of me that found that gas exports cost U.S. consumers $100 billion over a 16-month period. But I go back to what I hear from my neighbors in the Tampa Bay area every day. Because we're not tapping lower cost, cheaper energies like solar power, they've been overly reliant on gas, and it has been an enormous drag on their economic well-being. The electric bills are out of sight because we're tied to gas. It's too volatile. Also, I want to emphasize that the Biden administration closely considered Europe's energy security in making this decision, which followed a letter January 25th from over 60 members of the EU Parliament in support of taking a look at this. The letter clearly states Europe should not be used as an excuse to expand LNG exports that threaten our shared climate and have dire impacts on U.S. communities. Do you think it's important to consider our other policymakers overseas?
Certainly, Congresswoman, and that's part of the reason why this is an extremely measured, common sense announcement from the administration, because it has zero effect on current LNG exports or already approved LNG exports, the ones that are going to Europe.
And didn't recently at the Conference of Parties, all countries on the planet agree that it was time to transition away from fossil fuels?
Yes, at COP28.
And part of the reason is because that there are significant burdens on many communities across the country. So many of the communities along the Gulf Coast have long carried the burden of these dirty industries. Do communities along the Gulf Coast benefit from rising exports to countries like China, or are there significant environmental risks associated with expansion of LNG export terminals?
As a former resident of Gulf communities in Louisiana, Texas, and Florida, I have seen firsthand the impacts of energy expansion on the energy security and climate security of the Gulf. It's super important that we focus on the impact of these projects on Americans, both in terms of their pocketbooks, but also in terms of their overall energy and climate security. And the administration's pause will enable us to do that.
I wholeheartedly agree, and I compliment the administration for their willingness to take this look at our national security, affordability, and the incredible environmental impacts of what's going on. Thank you. I yield back.
Julie yields back. I'll now go to Mr. Pfluger from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to sponsor the bill that would push back on the administration. Let me read you a quote from September 6, 2019. Kiddo, I want you to look at my eyes. I guarantee you, we're going to end fossil fuels. That was candidate Joe Biden. And to hear my colleagues on the other side of the aisle say this is not a ban, give me a break. The administration has used every weapon available for 3 years, and this is the latest, but this is the most egregious. Let's talk about the impact. And by the way, for a Democrat witness, I do agree it is measured. I actually say it's calculated. It's very calculated. This decision is very calculated. So let's just talk about the impact of what this will do to not only our domestic production, our country, our economy, but to the geopolitical scene. And I'll start with Mr. Rice. Thank you for your testimony today. Has time been used as a weapon both previously, and is this another use of that? And what's the impact to EQT? What's the impact to your buyers? Tell us the story that you're facing.
Yeah, I mean, this is the playbook. It's delay, introduce uncertainty, and the playbook has been proven to be incredibly impactful and incredibly effective. Pipeline cancellations are probably one of the most destructive forces that are causing energy prices to be extremely erratic, and unfortunately, we're starting to see the beginning of that playbook on the LNG industry.
For Mr. McCown, talked about the geopolitical impacts. How does this affect our national security? And by the way, it's been said that this doesn't impact FTA countries. Well, there's 195 plus countries in the world and only 14 of them are FTA. So let's just make that point, that that's 7% of the countries. And the rest of them, and I'll get to a question from Ms. Gianetti, but talk just about geopolitical and national security impacts.
Yeah, well, it undermines that. I mean, it undermines American credibility, both from reassurances that were just recently given to countries, but more importantly than that, it potentially deprives our allies and friends of fuel sources they need for their own energy security. And if I may, real quickly, we study things to death, right? That's how you get rid of things. And so fool me once, fool me twice, KXL, DAPL, MVP. It's a little hard to take the administration at its word right now.
I take them at their word when President Biden, before he was president, said he's going to kill fossil fuels. That's exactly what he intended to do, and this is the playbook. I'll talk to Mr. Cormier. It's been mentioned, environmental justice. Some of the colleagues on the other side of the aisle talked about it, but they have concerns there. What's your perspective on what LNG and what the opportunities in some of these export facilities and plants, like the Commonwealth project has for your community?
When you look at the FERC map, and this is something I think is very important, that's why I would love to have our agency host a committee. These LNG plants or LNG facilities are not anywhere near folks that are spoken of as being impacted. I'm from what you would call North Lake Charles, which is the urban part of Lake Charles, born and raised there. There's no industrial facility anywhere in our community. These facilities on the coast, granted, Cameron Parish, what Cameron has, you have 230 people in Cameron proper. Cameron is a very small place, very important place, historically part of Louisiana's culture. Hackberry has about 1,000 folks where Cameron LNG is at. Chenier, right across, you have Port Arthur, right over the Sabine River. These impacts that we're talking about, especially when it comes to the populations that's being focused on, it's not in their backyard.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Ms. Gianetti, what percentage of the Louisiana grid is serviced by LNG?
What percentage of the Louisiana?
Electrical grid?
I do not know the answer to that.
50+%. So these are the people that we're worried about. All of us are worried about. So what I want to ask you is, if the law says that they must approve, as your testimony states, why is DOE stalling? We go from a 90-day approval process during the Obama administration to an average of 60 days during the Trump administration to an average of 365+ days during this administration. But yet you say that they must approve, as your testimony states. Why are they stalling?
What I said, Congressman, is that DOE is required to approve FTA authorizations. It is not only within its right, but it's actually in the legal requirement for it to do a public interest assessment for an FTA.
I think what we know is what candidate Biden said was he wanted to kill fossil fuels, and he's making good on that promise. And we are going to stand in the gap to push back on a really egregious, bad decision. That's why I'm proud to sponsor 7176, to push back on this administration and to strengthen our country's energy security, because we know it's national security. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chairman yields back. I'll now go to Mr. Pence from Indiana. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Duncan, Ranking Member DeGette, and thank you, the witnesses, for being here today. The Biden administration's ban on exports of LNG is another misguided decision to add to their disastrous and anti-American energy track record. By banning further LNG exports, this administration is making it clear that they favor radical environmentalists over Hoosiers and all Americans. American LNG exports are critical to our nation's energy security, and this decision plainly shows that President Biden and his administration lacks a competent understanding of global energy markets. This action could severely impact necessary investment into natural gas infrastructure over the next decade and beyond. Businesses need certainty that they can produce, distribute, and sell their products. In the 3 years since Biden took office, this administration has made it more difficult to produce energy, nearly impossible to distribute, and now have taken steps to ban the sale of American products abroad. Unfortunately, decisions affecting natural gas production and distribution affect long-term investments that could take years to be fully realized, and this is in an industry that's spent over 100 years delivering energy where it needs to be, when it needs to be, and in an affordable way. Mr. Rice, my question is for you. I spent my career distributing petroleum products across the country. As you well know, the gas supplies underneath your feet in Marcellus are only worth your ability to deliver it to end users and monetize that. Your testimony talks about the infrastructure inefficiencies that are borne onto the consumer. How have decisions by this administration, including efforts to ban LNG exports, impacted investment in the distribution chain, and how does that affect the consumer?
To have an environment where over, I'd say almost 10% of the pipeline capacity of projects would be canceled, to have an environment where it requires an act of Congress to get a pipeline built, ask yourself, which pipeline company is actually, what is it going to take to actually step out and invest in another project? It's going to take a whole heck of a lot. And so it's been absolutely chilling. And unfortunately, the approach if we're taking that same approach with infrastructure in the form of LNG, it's going to have the same end result. And it's going to be unnecessarily high energy costs, and it's going to be a lost opportunity for our communities in this country.
And the delay is going to be costly for your company, and you're just going to have to get your investment back. Is that correct?
That's correct, and that means that we're not going to be able to share this amazing decarbonizing resource that we have, that we are blessed with the world. And what that means is that the world is going to continue to use more coal, emissions are going to continue to skyrocket, and we're going to sit here maybe happy that we stopped energy infrastructure in this country, but we have done nothing to meet our objective to lower global emissions. We have done nothing to provide energy security to the world and Americans as long as we don't get smart about getting back to building things in this country.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Rice. I'm going to yield the balance of my time to Mr. Armstrong.
You're next. Can I get it? Yeah. Just for a couple of seconds. I thank the gentleman. You know, American energy production, delivery, utilization, and export means jobs. We've heard a lot about social justice and whatnot. I can tell you, Mr. Cormier understands this in Lake Charles and southwestern Louisiana. But I've traveled from Lafayette to Houma through Thibodaux down to Port Fourchon. 4-lane highway on both sides of the road, business after business after business after business after business supports what goes on onshore and offshore. People go into jobs in the energy sector. But guess what? Those companies support the YMCA and the United Way and the Chambers of Commerce, and they eat at the local restaurants, they tip the waitresses, and they tithe at their churches. Jobs, that's what the energy sector provides. And this policy shuts down export terminals and the ability of energy producers to help change global emissions and support our allies around the world. That's what it means. But jobs here at home is more important to me. I'll yield to Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you. I just have a really quick question because it's been brought up a couple times. We're talking about this EU letter, Parliament letter that was signed by, my understanding, if not most, if not all of the people who signed that are actual communists. Mr. McCown, are you aware of this letter?
I'm aware that at least some of the signatories are members of the Communist Party, members of the Green Party, other far-left parties in Europe. You know, this is very instructive, though, because whether, I thought it was 76, but maybe it's 67, whatever it is, there are 705 members of Parliament. So obviously, a decision didn't go over very well.
Gentleman's time's expired. I'll now recognize Mr. Armstrong for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I serve on committees that get a little more heated, and we're here, and I have a hard time with some of this. But I just want to be clear. Environmental justice is not a policy position. It's a buzzword that you can use at a cocktail party at MIT or in Manhattan or Minneapolis. And you know how I know that? Because there's no environmental justice to the 14-year-old slave going into a cobalt mine in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There's no environmental justice to the Uyghur community that is building these solar panels because we disallow the ability to do the mining for these products at home. Environmental justice is the emotional hook to drive up the cost of traditionally cheap and reliable energy, combined with how we continue to create the federal subsidy market in order to reset the American energy production. And I don't know where the environmental justice is in communities like Beulah and Hazen and Washburn and Underwood in North Dakota if Representative Pallone and Peters have their way and we shut down lignite energy production in North Dakota, particularly when we have EPA primacy and are working on some of the most advanced carbon capture technology in the world. And I sure as heck don't know where the environmental justice is in Western North Dakota when it's 70 degrees below zero and the heat goes off because the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, and we're become far too reliable on intermittent power. But the Biden administration recently decided to take place a temporary pause on pending decisions export liquefied natural gas. We've heard the administration claims that this pause is to reevaluate the current economic environmental analysis DOE uses to underpin its LNG export authorizations. And the natural gas is relied on by our allies in Europe, and I would talk, if I have time, Mr. Rice, I'm going to talk about not just displacing natural gas with coal, but these infrastructure projects all across the world are being built out right now, and we are sending signals that are saying that our LNG is not going to be available, and they're going to get it from somewhere else, oftentimes from people who are no longer, are not necessarily friends and allies of the United States. But whatever the new criteria is and used to evaluate CP2 would be expected to be applied to the other 16 proposed natural gas terminals that are awaiting approval. This will have major impacts on domestic LNG production. CP2 alone would export up to 20 million tons of natural gas per year, increasing the current amount of exported American gas by about 20%. And earlier we had some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle talk about the maturity of this decision. In advance of announcing this major policy change with huge national security and economic impacts, the White House took a meeting with a man named Alex Harris. According to the New York Times, Mr. Harris is a 25-year-old Colorado social media influencer who has led a TikTok and Instagram campaign aimed at urging young voters to demand that Mr. Biden reject the project. He's also the creator of a popular YouTube video entitled How I Live in My Car Full-Time, where he has described how to live full-time in a 2015 Subaru Outback SUV. I ask unanimous consent to introduce a New York Times article, a Daily Caller article, and the homepage of this man's YouTube channel. And I can't believe I'm talking about this while we're talking about LNG exports and national security. In fact, his social media work has gotten the attention of Ali Zaidi and John Podesta, senior advisors to Mr. Biden on climate policy, and helped influence that decision. Mr. Harris, according to his LinkedIn, is primarily a professional photographer who apparently, again, lives in his car full-time. I don't see any further substantial qualifications for environmental science or energy policy for him. Mr. Cormier, do you think it's proper to have Mr. Harris, a 25-year-old internet star, to be influencing such monumental national security and economic decisions?
He has a right to express his opinion.
Absolutely.
All I would ask is that if anyone has anything to say about how Southwest Louisiana and Southeast Texas impacted, come visit and talk to everyone.
The National Gas Act establishes a rebuttable presumption that a proposed export of natural gas meets the public interest requirements to DOE to grant an export application unless DOE can overcome that presumption. The administration has end-run the entire system by forcing DOE to reevaluate its evaluation criteria. The point of all of this process is to ensure that the political whims do not interfere with the expert processes that have been carefully crafted by Congress. I have 2 seconds, so Mr. McGowan, I'll have to submit this question to the record. I yield that.
Chairman, time's expired without objection. The articles that he wants to submit for the record will be entered into the record without objection. So ordered. And now I will recognize Dr. Joyce for 5 minutes.
First, I want to thank Chairman Duncan for holding today's hearing on Biden's disastrous decision and thank the witnesses, especially those from Pennsylvania, for appearing. Last night, during a special order, we had 14 members of the House take time to speak on how important liquefied natural gas exports are to their constituents, to our national economic security.
In my district, exporting LNG means jobs. Chairman Duncan just recently emphasized that in his just moments ago. The shale revolution has unlocked the resources under the feet of my constituents. The boom in natural gas production has brought jobs and hope back to so many small towns across Pennsylvania. Our nation has been blessed with abundant natural gas reserves, and the ability to export LNG has given companies the certainty that they need to continue to invest in natural gas production. Mr. Rice, do you have any idea what the average salary for an employee of EQT in Pennsylvania is, or what the range is for a worker at your company, what they can expect to make?
EQT offers very high-paying jobs, most entry-level positions starting in that $70,000 to $80,000 range, but many north of six figures. And I would say in the field, for our service providers, offer jobs where we're close to six figures with just a couple of years of experience. So it's an amazing opportunity that we share the success of this shale. It goes beyond our company to the thousands and thousands of service providers in our industry.
Family-sustaining wages, jobs that my constituents rely on. Mr. Rice, what would be the impact on your business if there were no new LNG construction applications in the pipeline? And how would this affect your ability to plan for workforce development and hiring?
Well, I think that the industry would be paused and be standing still. And unfortunately, the pressures against our industry would probably grow because a lot of the pressures that we face are out of people's concerns over climate. And when you pause LNG and you pause American natural gas, you pause the world's ability to make an impact with climate, and that would have a negative impact, which is ironic because the one thing that people are looking to block is the one thing, because of their concern for the environment, is the one thing that people should be supporting because of their concern for the environment.
Mr. Rice, I know you've been asked many questions here today, but I'd like to give you the opportunity to address any of the issues that we haven't adequately touched on in this hearing. More simply, what should we in Congress take away from this hearing?
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about the security part. You know, there's a lot of discussion about price and exports, increasing pricing. When's that going to start happening? We're the largest exporter of natural gas in the world, and natural gas prices are below $3. So when is the rise in natural gas prices going to happen? And to put this in perspective, $3 natural gas price is the energy equivalent of $18 barrel oil. So this is the most affordable energy that we can put on the planet. And it's also the cleanest, and it's also the most reliable. But speaking to the larger benefit of LNG, you know, we hear a lot of talking points on the Hill that we are the largest producer in the world. We are the largest exporter. But the question that we need to ask ourselves, is that enough? Rampant inflation, wars in Ukraine, global emissions skyrocketing, energy security of our allies is crippled. Clearly, we need to be doing more. And from an energy security perspective, the world can only contain so much chaos before it starts spilling over and impacting Americans. Well, American LNG can help relieve some of this pressure that this world is facing by lowering global emissions and providing energy security to our allies. Those things are going to help America achieve the goals that we seek to achieve.
Mr. Speaker, I thank all of the witnesses for being here today, and I yield the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. I now go to Mr. Allen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to wave on to this important hearing today, and I want to thank the witnesses. Mr. Rice, I met you back, I serve on the House Energy Action Team, and I was really intrigued by some of the things that you shared with us that day. I was just looking, and in fact, we might enter this into the record, but our trade deficit, this is an article in the New York Times, our trade deficit has exceeded $1 trillion, the most in history. And I believe you said and shared with us at that meeting that if you could get permits for pipelines to ship LNG out of off the coast of Louisiana, that we could power the entire continent of Europe. Is that still a possibility?
Yeah, based on the work we've done to quantify the resource, we have the ability to quadruple our LNG exports to support 60 BCF a day of natural gas production through exports, and that would require a $4 natural gas price to be able to unlock the drilling and development of that resource, and we can put it on the doorsteps of our customers around the world for a cost of less than $12. And for perspective, the European market is around 55 BCF a day of natural gas, so 60 BCF a day of exports is a tremendous amount of energy, equivalent to adding a Saudi Arabia to the world stage, decarbonizing force.
Let's look at the situation. So if we do that, we're burning 42% cleaner than we're currently burning over there?
Yes, the estimate should be between 40 to 50% at a minimum, and if we target some of the worst emitting coal plants in the world, 5% of the world's worst coal plants are responsible for 30% of the power emissions. If you target the displacement of those coal, the environmental impacts are significantly greater than 40 to 50%.
Why is the climate lobby not going nuts about this ban? I mean, when we can actually reduce carbon footprint, I mean, the equivalent of that would be, I've been told it's more than every American driving an EV. I mean, it's extraordinary what we could do. And it's basically because of what you have done for this country, we've actually reduced our carbon footprint substantially here. And guess what? We're getting no love for it. All they're doing is trying to put you out of business. This is amazing to me. It just baffles me. The other thing is at stake here is national security. If we starve Russia, they're not going to have the money to fight the war. So we bring about peace in Ukraine, and guess what? We stop Iran. Then we have peace in the Middle East. All of a sudden, it's 3 years ago when this country dominated, this country set the cost of a barrel of oil and the price for natural gas. Folks, that is power. And if you don't have that in this world today, then we're going to look just like we are right now. I do have one quick question for Mr. Cormier. You mentioned how important LNG exports are for your region economically as far as job creation and revenues and just benefits to your local communities. What does it mean to them? Mr. Crown? Okay.
Repeat the question if you don't mind.
Okay. You had mentioned that how important LNG exports are for your region economically and how the investments through job creation and revenues benefits your local communities.
And it brings pride because in our neck of the woods, people want to work. We have kids at McNeese. We have kids in our community college. They're being trained. They're ready to work. They want to rebuild, stay home, and continue moving forward. It's real with our community. It comes down to one thing. We want to take care of ourselves and take care of our community, and this is one way we do it.
The greatest privilege I had in business was the opportunity to do just what you're talking about, and that's to give people the dignity and respect they deserve with a good job, to allow them to provide for their families, their church, their communities, and yes, this country. How could we deny that with this great opportunity? This thing has been teed up by the creator of the universe for this country, and we're ignoring it. I mean, we were created to adapt, and we were created to work. And anything this government perpetrates other than that will not work. And we will see the destruction and chaos, and we're seeing it right now in this nation. Thank you all for being here. Thank you. Keep the faith and keep working at this. And hopefully the American people are listening and we will change the behavior out there. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Jim, yield back. We're going to pause for just a second. There's one member who is handicapped. There's another that is on her way, so just bear with us just a second.
Are you pausing or are you banning?
Carter's handicapped more ways than one, but
We're going to have a debate over that just now while we're waiting.
yeah, he is on a cycle for his foot, but just give us a second. I'm glad we talked about you before you got here. All right, Mr. Carter from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. I'm wheeling around here these days, but thank y'all for being here today. LNG is extremely important. Extremely important in my district. My district includes Elba Island, which has been converted from an import facility to an export facility. Right now, we're trying to increase the amount of export that we can do there, yet this administration is stopping that with what I consider to be, and many of my constituents consider to be, poor policy and poor planning. Look, I believe in climate change. I'm chair of the environmental subcommittee, and I believe in climate change. I served on climate change, the select committee on climate change. I represent the entire coast of Georgia. Environment's extremely important to us. I get it. And I do believe that man has an impact on it. However, I do believe it's cyclical too, and I believe we have to take an all of the above energy strategy approach to this. LNG, and look, this is a global problem. We all understand that. I don't think anybody disagrees that it's a global problem. We have some of the cleanest gas here in America, and yet we're going to stop sending it. This is another example of the administration picking winners and losers. So I just, I'm baffled by this. And of course, I don't understand the economics of it. I don't understand the environmental impact of it, of this decision. So we know that this is probably more than just a pause. And we know that the ultimate aim here is to end LNG exports. Let me ask you, Mr. Rice, first. What's wrong with investing in innovations that can mitigate and reduce emissions from reliable fuel sources like LNG or coal, which still make up almost 80% of our energy consumption?
We should continue to innovate and make the energy we produce cheaper, more reliable, and cleaner. And that is exactly what U.S. LNG is. It's the cleanest, most reliable, most affordable form of energy that we can deliver to the world. And to your point about it is a global issue. The reason, look at what's happened right now in the United States. We are the world leader in lowering global emissions, but global emissions are still skyrocketing. What does that tell you? We cannot solve this problem by just focusing inside of our borders. We got to start asking bigger questions. What can the United States do to lower emissions outside of our borders? And American LNG is the biggest, most impactful, powerful tool that we have to move us forward and start helping our allies meet their climate goals.
I couldn't agree with you more. You know, the United States of America in the last 10 years has decreased our carbon emissions more than the next 12 countries combined while growing our economy. And I'm often critical of the fossil fuel industry because I don't think they do a good enough job of telling the public the innovation and the progress that they've made. And they have made great progress. Emissions are down with fossil fuels, and they need to be telling that story. And I think they're selling themselves short with that. Mr. McCown, let me ask you, what's wrong with investing in innovations that can mitigate and reduce emissions from reliable fuel sources like LNG?
Well, there's not. In fact, we should be doing that, and we're starting to do that with carbon capture technology for difficult to decarbonize industries. We have both the government and the private sector has added to reducing methane leaks and emissions and has done a pretty good job. Despite some of the earlier testimony, methane CH4 has gone down. It has not gone up, despite added production. So we're on the right trajectory. The question is, what is a realistic pathway to net zero that can be sustained without ruining the economy or destroying our national security? A transition period is not overnight.
That's a great point, and I appreciate you making that. Let me ask you, and go back to you, Mr. Rice. What's changed? What's changed since the last LNG studies that were done in 2018 and 2019 to warrant the Department of Energy to reconsider exports?
There have been some changes. Methane emissions have actually gotten better from this industry. And you will see us do a much better job with the transparency so we can showcase, as I mentioned, we need to knock methane emissions out of the park. Some of the things that we're doing that have taken place in the last few years, you're seeing responsibly certified gas. That is bringing in third-party environmental auditors to come in there and actually say the environmental results we're achieving are actually happening. We're taking to the skies to measure methane emissions. And for perspective, in Appalachia, we are monitoring the entire basin. And just to give some people some color on that, we are going to be monitoring for methane emissions across an area the size of France. We take this very seriously, and then we'll end by providing full cycle carbon intensities from the time the gas comes out of the ground, through the pipes, through the downstream facility, to the doorstep of customers. We'll have a full cycle carbon intensity score. These are going to be the things that we need to do and showcase the environmental communities to address their concerns over methane emissions.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for this great hearing today, and thank you for allowing me to wave on.
Thanks
I
for
yield
being
back.
here. And gentlemen, time's expired. I'll recognize Ms. Barragan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Gianetti, I want to first start by thanking you and NRDC for all the work that you all do on environmental issues, environmental justice issues. LNG exports are an environmental injustice and a climate disaster. They pollute minority and low-income communities along the Gulf Coast, which is already overburdened by pollution. We have heard directly from communities in these regions that they do not want any LNG facilities to be built in their backyards. Hilton Kelly, a resident of Port Arthur, Texas, gave this description of the impact of 2 nearby LNG export terminals on his community, with 2 more planned. Quote, "We have a disproportionate number of people here with cancer and respiratory problems. I have 2 grandkids who suffer from respiratory problems. 1 in 5 households has a child or elder person who uses a nebulizer for asthma. Our babies are literally suffering, and we are suffering. How much is too much for one community? No community should have to deal with this." My question to you is, can you talk through how the Department of Energy does not properly account for the impacts of LNG exports on frontline communities, and how the department should evaluate these impacts in future public interest determinations?
Thank you, Congresswoman. As someone who previously lived in Louisiana, Texas, and Florida, I have seen this firsthand as a high school teacher with students who had disproportionate asthma or other respiratory illnesses. And environmental justice is not just a buzzword. It is a legal requirement and a critical element of determining whether a project is in the public interest. Unfortunately, to date, the Department of Energy does not incorporate environmental justice impacts into its assessment. And so the ability to be able to take a second, pause, and revisit those studies to make sure that the very important impacts on especially low-income and minority communities are taken into account is a critical and common sense step.
Thank you. So how is this pause on new permit approvals of the proposed LNG export terminals in line with the Biden administration's commitment to environmental justice and protections for frontline communities?
The administration's pause is a balanced approach that respects Gulf communities. All current LNG export facilities will continue to operate, and all facilities that already have their DOE authorizations will continue to operate. But by being able to take a look and evaluate on the environmental justice impacts of continually siting these facilities in the same locations over and over again, many of which are disproportionately low income and communities of color, will make sure that we are not making some of America's best pay the price of energy development.
Thank you. Now, I serve on the Environment Subcommittee, and a few weeks ago, we had a hearing where Republicans opposed EPA's methane regulations for oil and gas wells. They opposed the methane emissions reduction program in the Inflation Reduction Act, and they attacked a pipeline safety program to detect and repair methane leaks. If Republicans were successful in their efforts to let the fossil fuel industry emit as much methane as they wanted, how would that make U.S. LNG exports even dirtier?
Leakage is a serious problem when it comes to evaluating the carbon footprint of natural gas. And unfortunately, leakage happens at all parts of the value chain, from upstream extraction to midstream transportation to export and eventual use. We should be doing everything that we can at this moment to make sure that we are ensuring that leaks are minimized to the maximum extent possible, because they have a serious impact on the overall carbon footprint of these types of projects.
Great. And in closing, Ms. Gianetti, thank you for being here today to testify. Is there anything, any other points or anything else you want to say as we close out the hearing?
I think it's important for us to remember what we are talking about and what we're not talking about. Again, as has been raised numerous times, the administration's pause has zero effect on all current LNG exports, regardless of what country they're going to, has zero effect on all approved LNG exports, including ones that would nearly double our LNG export capacity by 2027 and triple going into the 2030s. It only impacts far into the future LNG export potential for NFTA countries. It is important that when we're looking at facilities that will not be built until the 2030s or beyond, that we are factoring in 2024 data and 2024 science and information into those analyses. And so this pause is a common sense step to make sure that we're doing that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Generally yields back. I'll now go to Ms. Miller Meeks from Iowa for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And I would just say, Ms. Gianetti, that fascinating comment. The reason why it affects now, not in the future, is capital investment in an industry. If an industry knows it's being shut down, the intensive capital investment that is needed will not be put in place. I come from a state of Iowa. I also happen to be the vice chair of the Conservative Climate Caucus. Iowa has over 50% of its energy from renewables, to include biofuels, biomass, compressed renewable natural gas, manure, you name it. We have over wind and solar, and did have nuclear until that plant was shut 4 years ago. 60% of our electricity is from wind, and we're a net exporter of energy. We can both have a cleaner, healthier planet and climate, as well as grow our economy and have affordable, reliable, secure, and abundant energy. The greatest sense of environmental injustice to me is not allowing poor people or disadvantaged communities to be able to heat their homes because we make electricity unaffordable. In fact, more than 5 million people die every year due to exposure to excessively hot or cold temperatures. This is globally. Heat death is responsible for 1% of global fatalities, around 600,000, but cold kills 8 times as many people, 4.5 million annually. A 2019 study from the National Bureau of Economic Research estimates that driving down natural gas prices, the fracking revolution, saved more than 11,000 American deaths in the winter per year. Per year, 11,000 deaths were saved from 2005 to 2011. During that time, the U.S. was, and still is, a leader in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, all while increasing energy production and keeping prices low. Since 2005, the U.S. has reduced net greenhouse gas emissions by 17%, all while primary energy production in this country increased by 48%. And the use of natural gas played an irreplaceable role in this fact. Globally, according to the Energy Information Agency, primary energy consumption is expected to increase through 2050, and in all the COPs I attended, which have been 3, every single COP has said energy demand is increasing, not decreasing. So through 2050, somewhere between 16 and 57%, and global demand for natural gas will increase by 41% in 2050. In fact, I was in Vietnam just last week, and they were talking about the Biden administration's policy on LNG is hurting them because they had an energy crisis last year. Further, a study from the National Energy Technology Laboratory found in 2019 that U.S. LNG often produced fewer greenhouse gas emissions than other types of coal or gas used around the world, which means that U.S. LNG exports could actually be beneficial for climate change if the U.S. replaced those of other fossil fuels. And I've had this conversation with Special Presidential Envoy on Climate, John Kerry. We're not studying the greenhouse gas emissions or the life cycle carbon analysis of other types of renewable energy, such as wind or solar. With all of us think that it should be done, and I'm sure those children in the Congo having to dig out rare earth minerals out of the earth in the Congo think that it would be environmental justice for them to not have to do that to create solar panels and wind turbines. So, Mr. McCown or Mr. Rice, if the U.S. limits our LNG exports, will that result in lowering the use of LNG globally, or will it only result in more LNG exports from our adversaries, like Russia, China, or other countries that have dirtier oil and natural gas?
It will result in the usage of LNG from dirtier fuel sources, and if you look at the IEA or any other forecast, natural gas usage is going to climb out through 2050, not decrease. So it will do nothing.
I agree. The energy demand is going to grow. And to put this in perspective, because we're talking about how big and how much LNG does the world need, we've heard a couple Congress people talk about this today. If you care about lowering global emissions and replacing foreign coal, the biggest source of emissions, it would require 170 BCF a day of incremental natural gas, LNG. If you care about eliminating energy poverty, which you cited, and replacing the 120 BCF a day of biomass that is used as a primary energy source, that's another 120 BCF a day. The world needs 300 BCF a day more natural gas, and both of those things would be decarbonizing because it would be lower emissions than coal, and replacing biomass is also going to have a decarbonizing impact as well. Massive opportunity.
Thank you for that. And I'm agnostic of the energy source. I think we should be talking about lowering emissions and how we do that and have create a better environment rather than talking about the energy source that we want to eliminate. And what for any of the panel, what benefits do U.S. LNG exports provide to our allies and those who are supportive of us?
Sure, I would say one thing. I think energy security is the natural answer, and you can look at what happened in Europe as a great example of how American LNG provides that energy security. But the other lesson that we learned in 2022 is that without energy security, you cannot transition. So if you care about climate and making progress on that front, energy security is the foundation of making that happen, and American energy is the foundation of that security.
Mr. Cormier?
It's making a difference. Our people are stronger. Our people have a future. And by expanding LNG and making this industry as strong as it can be, America, Louisiana, Texas, and all states in between benefit.
Thank you so much. My time's expired. I apologize, Mr. McCown. Thank you for indulging me, Mr. Chair.
Young lady's time's expired. I would like to thank all of our witnesses. This will conclude the hearing today. Members may have additional written questions for you all. I remind members they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask that witnesses do their best to submit responses within 10 business days upon receipt of the questions. I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, that will be the order, and without objection, the subcommittee will stand adjourned.